Hello and welcome back to the U.S. EPA's Farm, Ranch, and Rural Communities Advisory Committee. This is the November 12th and 13th meeting. Tech support link is above the video player if you have tech support questions, and there will be an archive of this afterwards. With that, I'll turn it over to Tom McDonald. Tom?
Thanks, Dave, and welcome back to our meeting. I want to take this opportunity to thank Jamie Burr and the Water Quantity Working Group for all the efforts that they put forth so far. I think we all have a better appreciation of the complexity of the topic, and we appreciate all of the efforts that y'all have put into getting us to this point. Jamie, thank you for moderating the session today. Next on our agenda, as we begin the last session for today, is food waste. And moderating our session and bringing the food loss and food waste working group update is Matt Frond. Matt is the chair of our food loss and food waste working group. And so with that, Matt, I will turn it over to you for your work group report and the discussion to follow.
Thank you, Tom. So I hope everybody took the 15 minutes to get something to eat, since we're going to be talking about food waste. And I don't want anybody's stomach growling while we're trying to discuss it. So our group met 2 times, and we met on the 15th of October as well as the 23rd. We introduced each other and tried to get some idea of what expertise we had on the working group, just to get a feel for where everybody was starting from. And of course, we've all had a lot of personal experiences with food waste, and, starting in your own homes with what you throw out and talking about schools and what's going on with education process with kids and how much food is wasted there was a concern with the group, as well as restaurants. And then, you develop over into packaging, and then you start talking about expiration dates. So food waste can be a very complicated issue, and it has a lot of facets. They're all over the place, and it's kind of hard to focus in, but our job was to focus in on what EPA could do and what we as producers can add to the equation. So then we started questioning EPA, where they are in that arena, and what is the definition of food waste? How is EPA looking at it? Are we talking about food waste like, let's talk about a field of pumpkins? I grow an acre of pumpkins and I pick half the pumpkins for market and I leave the other half in the field. That's 50% food waste. But the reality is that those pumpkins didn't meet marketable standards. So for me, they just get tilled back into the ground for next year's crop. I don't look at that as a waste. I look at, I got this much production out of that field and the profits on that field. So we really need to get a definition of what is food waste and at what point is it waste. So when you start talking to a beer producer, they're making a lot of beer, but at the end of the process, we have a lot of brewer's grain. Is that a waste product, or is that a cattle feed that goes to the next reiteration, right? So then it's going out to the dairy farm and making milk. So we really needed to get more definition, and we're hoping that the speakers will help us with some of that. And we have 3 really good speakers that will be joining us and trying to fill in the gaps. We also started out our sessions before we even had the committee get together, is we listened to a TED Talk by a John Maddock. And that was very interesting to see how diverse this food waste is and how many players are in it. It's just everybody is in the food waste. We have Feeding Across America. We have World Wildlife Fund. We have Dairy Marketing Incorporated. There's just so many people in the food waste world, as well as EPA joining with other governmental partners. So we're trying to separate all those out and understand where we play in that ball field. And it's a little bit cumbersome. There's just so many places you could focus in on and make an improvement, but we really want to focus in on what we're doing in production. So we kind of went down this food recovery hierarchy. It's a inverted triangle. I think you all have access to it. And we're looking at trying to look at each one of the segments and understand where we're going to fit into that. And, you start with the source reduction. We're a little bit nervous about that one. Are we going to talk about regulating production? That's something that's of a concern to a producer. Is we understand that if you make less of a product, it's going to save resources. But then, supply and demand comes in, and it's just a matter of we want to make sure that we're not cutting off our nose to spite our face. So that was a bit of a concern. Feeding the hungry people is the next step down. We're all very interested in not having hungry people in the United States. We know that there's 8% of the population in the United States goes to bed hungry. That's a travesty. Nobody wants to see that. And there's a lot of work being done to try to resolve that. I don't think this committee is going to spend an awful lot of time on that unless we're directed to do so. Feeding animals would be the third rung down, and diverting these food scraps to animal feed comes with a lot of regulation and a lot of concern by neighbors. We have to worry about what that food's going to look like and what it's going to smell like and what our neighbors are going to think about us when we start feeding the animals. So there's quite a bit of interest in regulation in that. There's also a lot of packaging that comes with that we have to worry about. How do you deal with the plastics that come in with that food waste? And how much food waste can you bring into your farm before you start to have an overabundance of nutrients? So those are things of concern that we want to get more information on. The industrial uses, bringing in the waste oils and the renderings and converting that into energy with digesters is a really interesting place to bring food. Is it the highest value? What's the value of that food that you're bringing in? What is the value to the farm to take that food? So you're relieving some stress off the landfills, but you also now have that added nutrient to your nutrient management plan. What does that mean? So these are all things that we're trying to get a handle on, understanding what the ramifications are so that we don't overburden the farm trying to solve basically a public issue. Composting and making soil amendments, that's another whole thing where you can bring in these food scraps and make it into something that you're actually leaving the farm, but that requires all kinds of regulation as well with drainage and, the EPA's absolutely very interested in those facilities. And we also have a neighbor issue with those facilities. People are very concerned about that. And then, of course, the bottom of that pyramid is going into the landfills. Nobody wants to see that. It costs everybody when it goes to the landfills. So that's understandably the worst place for the food scraps to go. So we had a lot on our plate to try to identify what the issues are. And I think we found ourselves 3 very good speakers that can help fill us in on the gaps that our committee was really not understanding. And I'm hoping that we'll get some good information and some good discussion tomorrow. And with that, Tom, I'd like to see if we could see what our speakers have to say and educate myself.
All right, Matt, thank you very much. We've got a panel, 2 speakers that will be presenting in this first session. Lana Suarez is an associate chief in the materials management branch and leads the sustainable management of food efforts under the Sustainable Materials Management Program at the Environmental Protection Agency. Lana joined the agency in 2004, and previous to her present position, she supported federal agencies to meet sustainable goals, coordinated federal partnerships for urban waters, and reviewed pesticide labels. Our second presenter will be Dr. Gene Busby. Gene has worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture for over 25 years and is currently the USDA Food Loss and Waste Liaison in the Office of the Chief Economist. Prior to this position, she was on detail at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Resource Conservation and Sustainability Division. For most of her career, she has worked at USDA's Economic Research Service, first as an agricultural economist, then as the chief of the Diet, Safety, and Health Economics branch. So welcome, Dr. Busby and Lana. And I think, Lana, are you going to go first?
I am. Thanks for that introduction, Tom.
Floor is all yours. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, first, everyone can hear me, and I'm going to try to share my screen, so you just let me know when you can see things. How's that look?
We cannot see it.
Okay, let's try again.
There, we see it now.
All right, but you don't want to see that view. You want to see this view. Good? All right, great. All right, well, I am so glad to be here with you all today. Again, thanks for the introduction, Tom, and I'm Lana Suarez, and I lead the Sustainable Management of Food efforts at EPA. I'm really excited that you've already had so much discussion on this topic, and it sounds like you have some great questions. I'm hoping that between Jean and I will be able to answer many of those. So let's make sure I can advance. So again, EPA works to promote sustainable management of food. That is the area where I work, and that's our approach, where we seek to reduce wasted food and its associated impacts over the entire life cycle. And our sustainable management of food work is a part of our sustainable materials management program, which we like to call SMM. So I might use that acronym throughout, and that's sustainable materials management. And that promotes the effective and the efficient use of materials over their entire life cycle. This is just a quick overview of the topics I'm going to go over in my presentation today. I'm going to talk about our goal. We have a national goal, our federal interagency efforts, some of our partners. There are many, but I'm going to highlight just a few. Some of our measurement work, which you already had the what is food waste question. So I'll talk a little bit more about that and some of the other terminology that we use. And then do some highlights on some of the tools and resources that we have available. So first with the goal, in 2015, EPA and USDA jointly announced the goal to reduce food loss and waste by 50% by the year 2030. Now, we knew when we announced this was very ambitious, but we did it anyway, and we aligned with some of the international sustainable development goals to reduce food loss and waste by 50%. So this is our national goal, and it's also an international one. And since we announced, and EPA and USDA have been working on food waste issues for decades. So even before we announced this goal, this has been something that's been important to both of our agencies. And since we announced the goal in 2015, we were happy to have the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, join these interagency efforts. So this is one of the graphics that we created because in 2018, October 2018, EPA, USDA, and FDA signed a formal agreement together and launched the Winning on Reducing Food Waste initiative. In April 2019, the three agencies issued an interagency strategy on how we can improve coordination and better support communities, businesses, and other organizations in reducing food loss and waste. That was a very exciting effort for all of us to come together and really formally acknowledge this interagency partnership. And the strategy that we announced in April 2019 included several priority areas. We had 6. And I think you've seen these before in a previous presentation from some EPA folks, but these 6 priority areas are enhancing interagency coordination, increasing consumer education and outreach efforts, improving coordination and guidance on food loss and waste measurement. I'm going to talk a lot more about that as part of my presentation. Clarifying and communicate information on food safety, food date labels, and food donations. Collaborate with private industry to reduce food loss and waste across the supply chain, and encourage food waste reduction by federal agencies in their respective facilities. Because we can't just tell everyone else to do this, we've got to do it in our own facilities too. So we have a number of efforts there, and outside of the 3 agencies are really trying to work with other federal agencies to reduce food loss and waste in our own facilities. Over the summer, also the 3 agencies added contributing efforts to each of these priority areas on our website. So if you find the strategy online, you can expand each of these priority areas, and there are contributing efforts from each of the agencies, which we're all very proud of. There's a lot of work there that we did over the past couple of years. But I also wanted to mention, in addition to our federal partners, EPA has many other important stakeholders, such as our state and local partners. And also, I'll probably mention this a couple of times, we have regional representatives within EPA. So in the 10 EPA regions, we have one and sometimes more, one or more representatives in each of the regions that work on our sustainable materials management efforts, and many of them focus on sustainable management of food efforts. And they work really closely with the state and local partners and on various projects across the country. So they are a really important part of our team here at EPA. So in addition to our federal partners, our regional folks within our agency, our state partners, our local partners, we have a lot of other partners too, and some I've highlighted here. We have, and this is a brand new, we announced 2 new U.S. Food Loss and Waste 2030 champions this morning, and those are Meyer and UNFI. So right now we have 33 Food Loss and Waste 2030 champions, and these are businesses that made a public commitment to reduce food loss and waste in their own operations by 50%. So matching the national goal that USDA and EPA announced. So they are some of the industry leaders out there. We have their logos on our website. We use them in our webinars and different speaking engagements, and many of them have great stories to tell. And we like to match these leaders up with others within the same industry, so they have a peer network and peer partnering opportunities to help other facilities in the same sector, which has been very helpful to everyone, because there's a different levels of experience that exist there. EPA also has their Food Recovery Challenge, which is a voluntary incentive program in which organizations and businesses set data-driven goals, implement targeted strategies to reduce wasted food in their operations, and report results to compete for annual recognition from EPA. We have over 1,000 participants and endorsers in the Food Recovery Challenge. And these are grocers, local governments, educational institutions, food rescue organizations, restaurants, sports and entertainment venues, and hospitality businesses. So there's a data management system. They enter data annually. We pull the data annually, and we base the recognition based on the amount of improvement over the previous year. So there is a lot of data involved in the Food Recovery Challenge. And we have some success stories that we post in association with the awardees every year. So there's also some great stories out there. And then on the bottom of the slide, I just wanted to highlight some of the formal agreements that we've made over the past year. And one is with the Food Waste Reduction Alliance. And that includes the Consumer Brands Association, the Food Marketing Institute, and the National Restaurant Association. We signed that memorandum of understanding with that group, the Food Waste Reduction Alliance, in October of 2019. And then April 2019, we signed a formal agreement with ReFed. And you're going to be hearing from ReFed, I think, tomorrow as part of your meeting. And they are a great partner. We have a lot of great partners, but ReFed is definitely one of those leaders. And I'm sure they're going to provide a great presentation tomorrow. So we have our goal that I talked about, our federal partners, many of our stakeholders working with us on this topic. But why is EPA involved if you're still asking yourself that question, even though I've talked about all of this stuff? And I think we can start answering that with measurement. And that's where I wanted to spend a little bit more time today. So this slide is brand new, hot off the press. Our 2018 data was just released and posted today. So if there hasn't been a press release out yet, it will be soon. So these are new numbers. There's always a data lag when we announce our numbers. So it takes a while to post and then gather and then consolidate it all into our report. So even though it says 2018, these are the most recent numbers that we have that are related to food waste management and what's going into our landfill. So EPA has collected and reported on the generation and management of municipal solid waste in the United States for more than 30 years. And we publish these estimates of food waste generation and management in the United States annually. This came directly, I pulled it right out of the report this morning that's been posted. It's our facts and figures about materials, waste, and recycling report. And our 2018 numbers are, like I said, now just available today. We estimate that 35.3 million tons of wasted food went to landfills in 2018, representing 24.1% of all MSW landfill. So from our 2017 numbers, I think it was 22% of MSW was food. So it went up a little bit. That 24% is now food with our 2018 data. So this is where I was going to talk a little bit about what is food waste. I'm going to let Jean, who's going to follow me from USDA, talk a little bit about food loss, but I'm going to focus on food waste because this is what we measure in our municipal solid waste. It's plate waste, it's food that's been served but not eaten, spoiled food, or peels or rinds considered inedible. So it's stuff that we start measuring at the point that it's ready to be managed. So once it enters one of the various pathways of management is what we would put into our municipal solid waste report. Now, traditionally in our municipal solid waste report, we were only measuring 3 pathways, and that was composting, sent to landfills, and combustion. This is exciting this year and that this data is out because we started using a new methodology just this year that wasn't available previously, and it expanded the number of pathways because we knew that food was going to more places than just combustion, landfill, and composting. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But so very exciting that this report is now out. We have some updated numbers. And then you'll see in the next slide some of the updated pathways that we're looking at now, which gives us a better picture of where food is going. I think that's all I need to say about that, but if I'm sure there are questions, we can go back to this measurement. But exciting that this is now out. So what we did this year, and over the summer, we released a scoping memo, and it talked a little bit more about the various pathways and expanding the scope. So we in order to more accurately estimate how excess food and food waste are managed in the United States, EPA set out to expand its estimation methodology to capture the various methods in which excess food and food waste are managed and to align with the Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard, or the FLW standard. We might use that acronym too. Food Loss and Waste is FLW, which is a global standard that provides requirements and guidance for qualifying and reporting on the weight of food and or associated inedible parts removed from the supply chain. So our enhanced methodology examined the following management pathways, which significantly expand the scope beyond EPA's previously set of management pathways for food waste. So this is what I mentioned previously, which was just composting, landfill, and combustion. And now, if you look on the right side, that's where all of the management pathways are: the bio-based materials, biochemical processing, co-digestion or anaerobic digestion, composting, controlled combustion, donation, land application, landfill, and then sewer wastewater treatment are all of these new management pathways that we now have some ability to make estimates on all of those pathways. So the 2018 Facts and Figures report, which we saw the data from on the previous slide, is the first year for which EPA utilized our new enhanced methodology to estimate wasted food generation and management. So a little bit more on just to summarize some of the terminology. Food waste is what we would consider, it's going to be managed, it's thrown in the dumpster, it's thrown in your trash can at home. It's not edible, it's scraps. We use a broader term when we talk about food waste management, and it's on the top of the slide as wasted food. It's a broader term that we started using, because when we talk about food banks and donations specifically, we don't want to talk about food waste. That would be offensive to many to say that we want to donate food waste to feed people. We would call that wasted food or excess food. We use that term too. So we've been using this broader term, which is wasted food, that will incorporate many of these different terms together. But food waste is really measured at the point it's ready to be managed in these various pathways, but we usually consider that plate waste and inedible. So now that we know more accurately how much food is being wasted and all of these different pathways, and all those facts and figures are now up and available for 2018, we can talk a little bit more about why, because that seems to be another question that follows the management. And all of this measurement is another reason why EPA is involved. This is a valuable resource that we're throwing away, and unfortunately a lot of it is going into landfills. It's still a large component of what we're throwing away in our everyday trash. So that's one of the big reasons why EPA is involved and why it's a priority for us, that this is a valuable resource that we could be getting more benefit out of. So we can talk a little bit more about why it's being wasted. I'm sure we can all think about our own examples and our own reasons why food may be wasted in our own homes. I have 2 small children, and they are many of the reasons why food may be wasted at some point in my household. Maybe they didn't like what I made for dinner that night. Maybe, recipe didn't go quite so well. But overall, I'm pretty lucky with my little ones. But there are definitely plate scrapings occasionally that go into the garbage. But other reasons are spoilage due to improper storage or preparation, over preparation due to we just made too much. Misunderstanding date labels. That's been a big issue, a lot of misunderstanding. I'm sure no one on this call, or maybe you've already talked about it a lot, is that when a date on a can or packaged food, when you reach that date, it doesn't mean that the contents are going to explode or all of a sudden go bad. There's a lot more that goes into that, but I would encourage everyone to just use the sniff test and use your senses. And if it doesn't look right, if it doesn't smell right, it's probably bad. But the date should be no indicator that food is bad alone. There's a lot of bad habits out there. we have good intentions. We want to get ingredients for a new recipe, and we just never got around to it. Overbuying to keep the fridge stocked with, everything, just to be a good host, just in case, just so we have variety. Or poor planning. Those are all some reasons why food is wasted. There's other reasons why food may be wasted too, and the retail level, like equipment malfunctioning or over ordering, culling of blemished food or imperfect food. There's a lot of efforts right now to be able to utilize that imperfect food. Right now, a little processing makes those wonky looking fruits and vegetables taste just the same as their very perfect counterparts. So this is where we have that food recovery hierarchy, and which you were talking about a little bit earlier. And there are the different levels there. Source reduction, which I heard there was some concern about. I mean, this is what we'd like to encourage businesses to consider, these strategies in this order of preference as listed in the food recovery hierarchy. But we know that there are a lot of other factors that would go into making these decisions, right? You may not have an AD facility nearby. You may not have a composting facility nearby. You may not have that relationship with the food bank established already. So these are recommendations, and starting with source reduction, because preventing the waste in the first place means that you'll have less to manage later. If you have less to manage later, then you can save cost in managing that waste in different ways. So following the source reduction, we have the donation to feed people, and then feeding animals, industrial uses such as anaerobic digestion or rendering, and then composting. So again, these are recommendations. We know that there's a lot of other factors that go into making these decisions. And when we work with those partners that you saw on one of the previous screens, when they're trying to develop those strategies to reduce their waste at their particular facility or their grocery store, and we talk to them and provide that technical assistance using our regional representatives about what might work for them, we know that there's a lot of things to consider. What's available in their local area, for example, what is the existing infrastructure, what are the quantities, what are the feedstocks. So there's a lot that goes into that decision making, but we always talk about source reduction first because you'll have less to manage later if we can start there. And then here are just a few. There are many, and we can see more on our website, but there are several tools and resources that we have available. Further with Food, the Center for Food Loss and Waste Solutions. That's a website, and it provides information about food loss and waste in the United States and about the solutions dedicated to reducing it. This is crowdsourcing. We invite anyone and everyone to put in resources at this location, and it has a lot already. And we're always trying to point folks to search there for resources and you can filter it by different resources. You can add and you can filter and you can find different resources on this site. And it's been really helpful for us. And then Refed, who you're going to hear from tomorrow, also hosts this site now. So she might talk a little bit more about that. Also, Save the Food, that was a public service campaign. They have a bunch of great resources targeted toward households. They have printable assets and tips for storing and using leftovers. If you're going to have a gathering, maybe not right now we're having gatherings, but in a couple of years, maybe you might want to have a gathering, and there's a guesstimator, and you can, do a lot of planning through that tool. And it's really neat. We've used it before when we used to have parties in the office to try to do the best guess about how to prepare the right amount of food. And then two of the other resources I have on this slide, EPA supported in there from the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. One's a measurement practical guide, which provides a step-by-step plan for organizations all along the food supply chain to measure food loss and waste. And then there's a Food Matters Action Kit, which is full of activities and it's targeted to youth. And that's probably our most recent tool resource that's targeted toward youth. We have others, but this one is definitely the nicest and most recent one. So a number of tools and resources that we have available on our website. But the one I thought that this group might be the most interested in is our excess food opportunities map, where communities can use this map to support the diversion of food from landfills. And how you do that is you can really drill down to the community, the county level, and you can see the potential generators and the potential recipients in the area. And it can help you create those networks and see if there's any gaps in your particular area. And again, we provide this as a first level kind of snapshot of what might be in your area. There's always some supplemental information that you could add to it, but this was a tool that was originally available at the state level and at the regional level, but there was never anything available nationally. So we're pretty proud. We did some recent updates to this map. Again, it's got about more than 1 million potential generators, and these include correctional facilities, educational institutions, food banks, healthcare facilities, hospitality industry locations, food manufacturing and processing facilities, food wholesale and retail, restaurants, and food service. Those are all potential generators or sources of excess food that are pinpoint on this map. And then there's about 5,000 potential recipients, which are food banks, composters, and anaerobic digesters across the country. So it's pretty overwhelming if you use the whole national map, but when you drill down to that really local level, you can start to see the picture of what is available in a particular area. And one of our map success stories highlights a dairy farmer in Pennsylvania, and the farm built a digester to turn the cow manure into energy to heat and run the farm. But they quickly discovered that they had capacity to handle more organic waste, and that keeping the digester fed and running it at a relatively high temperature increased the efficiency, yielding more energy and less solid waste as an end product. So the farm started looking for even more sources of food waste to keep a near constant stream of organic material flowing into the facility. So they found this map an easy solution to locate those potential feedstock sources. So one of the successes, I thought that this group would appreciate that agricultural connection, and we saw that it was really helpful in that instance. So as I mentioned before, but it's worth mentioning over and over, that we have regional contacts, regional representatives that work on sustainable materials management efforts, including sustainable management of food efforts. And they offer supporting various local projects and convening stakeholders. EPA really has a role of convening the appropriate stakeholders, and they use their contacts and their networks to bring people together. And they've had a number of workshops across the country that are related to our map, for example, and brought the right people around the table to have some really productive discussions. So they can help convene, they can build networks, and they also offer the technical expertise with our voluntary incentive-based programs, with some of the tools and resources that we offer. And again, just being able to connect all of the right people together to have a really positive and productive discussion. So I think that sums up everything I wanted to talk about today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lana. We'll have Dr. Busby give her presentation next, and then when she's finished, we'll have a question and answer session for both speakers.
Great.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I'm going to pull up my screen now. Is that good for everybody?
Yeah.
Yes,
Looks
ma'am.
good.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to share work on what USDA is doing in the food loss and waste space. I really appreciate it. I wanted to start out a little bit about what the Food Loss and Waste Liaison does, because some of you may be curious about that. And then I'll go into our USDA Economic Research Service estimates of food loss, talk about three agencies, the big picture of the research on food loss and waste, provide some tools and resources, and then I'll conclude with USDA's Agriculture Innovation Agenda, which is a really ambitious target. Okay, well, so turning really briefly to my role as a food loss and waste liaison, this is a position that was mandated in the 2018 Farm Bill, where they asked the Secretary of Agriculture to create this position. I have 5 main things to do. I coordinate food loss and waste reduction efforts within the different USDA agencies, and I work with Lana and others at EPA, as well as staff from FDA under the Winning on Reducing Food Waste initiative. We meet several times a month. I also support and promote federal programs, anything to do with food loss and waste, and I serve as a resource for entities on food loss and waste. I also have a charge to raise awareness of the liability protections afforded under the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act. And also I make recommendations, not shown here. I also have, I'm encouraged to do cooperative agreements where there's funding possible, and also have some charge as far as reports to Congress. So the Economic Research Service, or ERS, which is my home agency, where I work the majority of my life, career that is, they're the ones that estimate food loss at the retail and consumer levels. And you're right to be confused about definitions. I know one person who counted 200 different definitions of food loss and waste. And I'm not sure if Lana covered it, but at the Food and Agriculture Organization, and increasingly in other parts of the developed world, the term food loss is really from the farm up to the retail gate, and food waste is retail and consumer level. And there's a food loss index and a food waste index being developed. The food loss index is being developed by FAO, and the food waste index is being developed by the United Nations Environmental Program, and with a goal of being able to measure food loss and food waste across the different countries better. Long story short, for the Economic Research Service, we only estimate food loss at the retail and consumer levels, and that's in 2010 estimates. And we estimate as 31% of the available food supply. And it translates into 133 billion pounds and $161 billion using retail prices, and 141 trillion calories. We couldn't do national estimates earlier than the retail stores because of data limitations. We just did not have enough information to do that. I'll quickly share with you how we calculate or estimate our food loss estimates. And I just also want to point out that the reason why they're so outdated 2010 is that we have 3 initiatives underway at the Economic Research Service to get improved or updated retail level and consumer level loss conversion factors to use in our data systems. In the biggest picture, I just want to quickly share with you how we estimate food loss. Basically, we use supply and use balance sheets, and for 215 different commodities like fresh apples, eggs, beef, canned tomatoes, and so forth. And for a given year, let's say fresh apples, we add up the annual production of fresh apples, beginning stocks that were carried over from the previous year, imports of fresh apples to get the total supply. We subtract out the exports of fresh apples. If there were farm and industrial uses like there are for grains, we take those away too, and any ending stocks to get the total availability of fresh apples in the U.S. in a given year. We divide by the U.S. population for that year, and we get a per capita availability. I don't want to spend too much more time, but then we take away loss at the retail and consumer levels and the non-edible share, and we estimate food loss for those 215 commodities, and then we aggregate them up. I can answer more questions about this if you want later, but let's move on for now. I also wanted to mention that the Economic Research Service, in addition to those 3 initiatives that are getting underlying loss estimates for use in that data system, ERS also does other economic research on food loss and waste. For example, there's one publication you might be particularly interested in on the economic drivers of produce loss, and that came out in January. The link's at the bottom. I'll share my slides with you at a later, after our meeting. 2 things that may be of interest is that each action to reduce produce food loss comes at a cost. So when you're reducing food loss and it's considered alongside goals like improving farm income, industry adoption of food loss initiatives may be more likely. And also there's a lot of really good reasons why food may be, economic reasons why food may be left unharvested in the field or not sold by a distributor. And here's just a few reasons: price volatility, labor costs, lack of refrigeration, consumer preferences, and so forth. In addition to this larger report, there is also a few shorter summary pieces that make that information accessible. I wanted to mention 2 other USDA agencies because of their great work in the food loss and waste space. We have our Agricultural Research Service, so that's ARS, and they're our chief in-house scientific research agency with over 2,000 bench scientists at 90 research centers, both domestically and abroad. And they produce all sorts of innovations and new technologies. A lot of the innovations use that excess food or the byproducts that remain after food processing, and then add value to it and create new products. A few quick examples of ARS research that has been commercialized are keepsake strawberries, because there's a lot of work that's done on new and hardier cultivars. This keepsake strawberries got extended shelf life, and it has been commercialized, and it's available and grown or produced in some nurseries both in Canada and the US, and the supply exceeds the demand. I mean, the demand exceeds the supply for that. There's also an automated infield apple sorting system that separates low quality from high quality apples at harvest, and it can do up to 10 apples in a second, and it really has increased the efficiency, and it can do it all without bruising. ARS also looks at different packaging that can extend shelf life, and one example is this new clamshell container for several kinds of fresh fruit and also cherry tomatoes. And this packaging maintains optimum humidity and prevents fruit weight loss during storage. Another agency that I want to quickly mention that does research on food loss and waste is the National Institute for Food and Agriculture. And so this agency is the extramural research arm. So they don't do their own research, education, and extension, but rather they partner with land-grant universities, government, private, and nonprofit organizations through different kinds of funding mechanisms. And just a few examples that they've done is there was a 2-day conference held by the University of Pennsylvania that resulted in a published book by CAST. And another innovation that they've done is a functional ice, which melts slower than traditional ice, and it can be also used as a slow release of antimicrobials to keep spoilage under control of produce. And right now they're at the stage where the researchers are now looking into the commercialization of this. They also, some of these innovations, both at ARS and NIFA, have multiple objectives. This last example also has it helps with food safety as well as minimizing food waste. It's a test strip that reduces the time for Salmonella, Campylobacter, and different kinds of major foodborne pathogens to get the results back. What used to take 24 to 72 hours now can take only 30 minutes. And so that's time saved, may reduce the spread of pathogens, and again, minimize food waste. As I mentioned, one of my charges is to talk about liability protection for donating food under this Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act, where this act removes liability for persons and gleaners who make good faith donations to nonprofits that feed the hungry. And here this term person includes farmers and ranchers. And here are two resources for that. I also want to echo what Lana mentioned about date labeling. There's a lot of consumer confusion on date labeling. Our Food Safety and Inspection Service has developed fact sheets to reduce consumer confusion on that. And they also are taking the stance to encourage the best if used by phrase, because there's confusion about sell by, use by, all sorts. Another tool I want to mention, since we are all consumers of food, is the Food Keeper app, which provides guidance and safe handling, preparation, and storage of more than 650 food items. And you can track storage times of different foods that you've purchased. It can tell you how long to thaw and cook your turkeys. It gives you information on food recalls and so forth. And this is all free online. I wanted to conclude with a really ambitious USDA Agriculture Innovation Agenda. This is one of Secretary Perdue's priorities. It's a department-wide effort in the sense that it involves many different USDA agencies to align USDA resources, programs, and research so that it can really equip farmers to position American agriculture as a leader in meeting the demands of the future for food, fiber, fuel, feed, and climate issues. I want to say that this is really ambitious because they hope to stimulate innovation with the goal of increasing U.S. agricultural production by 40%, while at the same time cutting the environmental footprint of U.S. agriculture in half by 2050. It's really multifaceted. There's a lot to this innovation agenda, and this information is available on the USDA website. But I wanted to mention, as far as food loss and waste, again, the idea is to be able to measure, are we meeting this national goal of reducing food loss and waste by 50% in the U.S. by 2030? And so there's a lot of effort to that. Where we are, it's very much in process, but the USDA agencies are currently developing implementation strategies for our internal USDA recommendations for where to go with our food loss and waste metrics. In general, this involves improving our current data and estimation methods and exploring alternate approaches to track food loss and waste. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Let me stop sharing my screen and we can go back to Lana, and I can help you any way I can.
Can I open up with a question? Is Tom, I don't know how you want to run this. Is it just start with questions?
Yes, this is your program, so take it
All right.
off.
Well, I just wanted to kind of look for a little more in-depth economics on the farm side of it. So just to give you a little background, I've been digesting since 1997. And the problem here in Connecticut is for me to accept any food waste, I'm required to spend $25,000 on a DEEP permit to accept, even if it's one banana peel. So that's kind of a deterrent for me to be a resource for any of the food waste. And then the other thing that occurs is when these farms, and I'm not the only one, but there's a number of farms that have been digesting, start pulling in this food waste, they're bringing in a large amount of nutrients that are going up against their nutrient management plans. And we have to capture that nutrient in some form or another to make sure that the farms don't overburden themselves with a pollution problem. So I was kind of wondering, is there anybody, any agency out there looking at the value of this food waste to convert it to energy? What's that value? What's an apple worth? Running it through a digester, and then the cost of moving that apple back to a place where it's environmentally friendly to put it, right? So when I put through my digester, it's now not an apple, it's actually manure. Where do I put that manure in an environmentally sound manner, and what's the cost of that? So we have, both the income to take the apple and then the expense of dealing with the apple after it's done being made into energy. And I'm looking for a resource to find that information.
If I may mention this, and this was a long time ago, maybe 5-10 years, maybe even longer, but there was an EPA study that was trying to build a model or a spreadsheet on where to site digesters. And I think this was coming out of California, and it looked at all sorts of different inputs because, first of all, you need the economies of scale. You need a large enough volume to make it worthwhile. And if we could find that for you, that would provide a lot of good information. I haven't really, for us in our food loss estimates, the value of an apple is we use retail prices. But I've not ever come across the value of an apple, for example, for a digester. I just haven't seen that. Yeah. And in general, data limitations are huge. I mean, we've really come a long way 10 years or 20 years ago. Food loss and waste was barely kind of reared its head up every decade or so, but it didn't really get here to stay like it is now, both domestically and internationally. We hear so much of it.
Well, so the issue is that this committee is trying to come up with recommendations for EPA, and I think that the economy or the values of food waste as it goes down that pyramid, right? At the top of the pyramid, that value is the retail value, and that's absolutely, if we can get it to people eating that apple, that's wonderful. But as that pyramid comes down, we have to reduce the values of those, and then we also have to increase the cost of dealing with it. So the worst case scenario is the municipality. We put in the landfills, the cost everybody. Every taxpayer is going to pay that. And what we need, I think, to make good recommendations to EPA is an understanding of what the value of that food waste is as it goes down the pyramid, and then how we can convert that value to either the farmer getting that value to deal with the product and do it at a reduced rate from the municipality or whatever. But I think if we can equate it all to the dollar, it's going to be easier for us to understand the best place and the best purpose of that wasted food.
Of course. I mean, I just wanted to add that it's, there's so many different factors that would, as I mentioned, there's different available infrastructure, transportation, distance that would all be factored in. So there'd never be an overall national value that we could put on that apple that you used as a good example. But we do have some data. We've been collecting now, we have an anaerobic digestion data collection project that we've been using to feed into our excess food opportunities map. So we have some data now on the capacity that's out there, the locations of facilities that go into the map, and other different things that are associated with anaerobic digestion and those who are co-digesting food. But when we talk about that upside down pyramid and the hierarchy, we know there's a lot of different factors that would go into making those decisions. REFED is an acronym that stands for Rethinking Food through Economics and Data, and that's who will be speaking with you tomorrow. And they have a number of different resources, and they have this document called the roadmap that has a different policy approaches and different valuations for different approaches and strategies. But I'm not familiar with anything that is going to value that particular feedstock. But that's part of our sustainable materials management program when we try to look at things in a more effective and efficient way. This is a valuable resource, but we do have to consider the transportation to get it from point A to B, and what are all of the other things that you would have to do to prepare your facility to take that feedstock. So there's a lot of things to consider, but I like your question, and I'm going to think about it a little bit more, see if there's anything else that we could share that would be helpful and get to that valuation that you're looking for.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's also a very interesting conversation. And I guess also the feedstock, what's in the feedstock matters as far as the ultimate value. I've done, for one journal article, I kind of just did a little test on the food loss for apples, or no, it was fresh tomatoes, where I looked at the amount of acres or land used to produce those apples, the amount of fresh water, and so forth, and the different components. But you're totally right that as you go from farm to table, the closer you get to the table, the more of that embedded value. And that's why your food recovery hierarchy, the prevention is best before all that value has been added to the equation, or resources, the cost of all the resources been added to the equation.
Yep.
Matt, Jeanette has her hand up.
Oh, okay.
Jeanette, you're on mute.
Sorry about that, Tom. Thank you. I have two little questions. One, I was sort of looking for some trend analysis. I like the new data that you gave, but I'm really concerned about plastics. They're huge in agriculture in California. We, use them for strawberries, our strawberry plantings. We use them in our hoop houses. So I sort of wanted to know if you're seeing a decrease in that trend analysis. And then the second thing was, we've had a lot of growers out here try the ugly fruit boxes, and it didn't seem like the consumers picked up on that. And I sort of wanted to know what education and outreach you're doing to the consumer sector to get them to take product that is not necessarily meets the grade for regular retail sale.
Those are great questions. Plastics and the nexus with food is definitely a hot topic right now. That is also something that we capture in our facts and figures on materials, waste, and recycling. I'm not the plastics expert, but again, I can find that information and share it with this group so you can see where plastics fit in our municipal solid waste. But it is a hot topic. Mm-hmm.
A question about that. When in the figures for tons of food waste, does that include the plastics? Does it include packaging? Or does that is that the food product itself?
I'm guessing that it's just the food product itself. Sometimes plastic is very minimal in that weight. I mean, we're looking at tons. But I haven't seen a breakout if the plastic is weighed with the food waste. I mean, I'm sure there are some. I mean, how we do it and the modeling and the estimation, we're not going out and sampling, real piles that are at every landfill or dump. We're using estimations. So we are trying to just estimate the food and not food and packaging. Packaging is measured separately.
So when we take in a load of product that goes into the digester that it's weighed by the ton dumped on your farm, and that includes all of the packaging that you then have to deal with. So I think it is part of the food waste. Emily, you have a question?
Well, I was going to ask about the ugly fruit still. I wanted to know.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, Jeanette.
No,
Go ahead.
it's my previous question I asked. I just wanted to know why the ugly fruit marketing campaign didn't take off.
I mean, that's some of the analysis that we'd love to be able to do. There's a lot of different strategies out there. We know that there are these pockets of different opportunities, like with imperfect or off-spec produce, and what's going to work. We don't have those data. We don't have data that show what's actually working. We have different strategies that have been implemented, but we don't have a lot of data to show what's going to really work in a particular area, but that's something that we are looking into to see what's going to work. I mean, I can only speak from my own personal experience that I got a box today of imperfect produce that I'm going to incorporate into my cooking for the next week. And I think, you were talking about cost, that really speaks to people. I really see that speaks in this area too. I mean, we as humans want to pick the most perfect apple out of that huge pile, or the most perfect tomato, because we see that we're getting a greater value for that product. But if it's put in a side bin and it's a little bit less expensive, we know that it's just as good. But cost is definitely a driver that's going to help change some behaviors for many. So we are aware that this is an opportunity where we can spend a little bit more time and really figure out what can work there.
Thank you.
I want to mention that in our food loss estimates at USDA, packaging is not part of it. I also want to say that consumer behavior is very hard to change. We've been trying to get people to eat healthier and lose weight for a long time and be at the appropriate weight for them. It's very hard to move the needle. There's a whole relatively new area of economics called behavioral economics, and it's trying to understand, and there's centers at Cornell, for example, how to get school children to make healthier choices in their school lunch lines. There's growing work in the research community, but there's just not been enough done on the consumer end at this point for the ugly fruit. At first, when you mentioned it, I was wondering if you were talking about the Farmers to Families food box of USDA, but you were talking about the ugly fruit box. Okay.
Emily, you've been waiting.
Thank you, Matt, and Lon and Jean. It's really good to see both of you. Thank you so much for speaking and sharing, and it's good to hear all the updates. I had a couple questions that I wanted to ask. One, I'm so sorry to ask a few at once, but the first was just, I think, maybe both of you can speak to this, but I was thinking more to Lana, the Winning at Reducing Food Waste National Strategy. I don't know if it would be helpful to know of the 6 priorities, there's ones that EPA is taking the lead on, and or like would it be useful for our working group to really think about a couple of those in particular? And I think it kind of relates to, I don't know if you were both on when Matt was explaining some of how the working group is focusing our efforts, which is really on, first, what specifically can EPA do in this landscape, knowing that a big piece is partnering with other agencies, but what can EPA do in particular? And then the second is, what are the opportunities, in particular looking at farmers and agricultural producers? So, sort of thinking about how that interrelates with the strategy. I have one other question, but maybe I'll pause on that.
Okay, well, thinking about the Winning on Reducing Food Waste strategy and all the priority areas, I mean, there's definitely ones that we see as, EPA could have a bigger role in, like the first one is just the interagency coordination. So that's for our own internal efforts. We know that there's more consumer education and outreach that we could do. We're all trying to do that together, but that's one where I feel like EPA could do more, and there's some opportunity there. I talked a lot about our measurement efforts. That's another one that I feel like EPA definitely has a role. We have this key report that comes out annually. We have a goal with USDA, so I don't see either one of us really taking more or less of a lead on measurement. We both have some measurement work that we do, but I do see EPA's role with the measurement just because of our annual report and the one that came out today, which is exciting. If you're excited about data, it's exciting it came out today. I do see the date labeling, food safety date labeling and donations more in USDA and FDA's lane than it is for EPA's lane. I mean, we listen to the conversations a little bit, but we have a little bit less of a role there. As far as collaboration with private industries, I think that's something that we can all do. But as I showed you from our list of partners, I do think that that is something that an opportunity for EPA to work a little bit more with USDA and FDA. But I see that that's an opportunity for EPA, that collaboration, because of our voluntary incentive-based programs that we already have established. And then the last one is just in our own facilities. So really, I guess I see the consumer education and collaboration with private industry as one's opportunities for EPA.
It would be my perspective as well.
Yeah.
Lana and I and others at EPA and FDA, we actually, when we meet, we look at those 6 priorities and the winning on reducing food waste, because we're trying to do something in each of the 6 areas. And Emily, I know you're aware of that new report on the consumer level strategies to reduce, and with information there, information we know, and we also know that in the developed world and countries like ours, that a high percentage of food loss and waste occurs at the consumer level. So there's great room for improvement if we can figure out the right messaging. Elaine Blatt at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, she's done some survey work with Oregonians, and one thing that her message that came through her work is what Lana had mentioned earlier, using the dollars. Getting the message that resonated the most was wasting food is a waste of money, and particularly nowadays with so many unemployed, I think it can really resonate.
Barry, you want to chime in?
Sure. Thank you, Matt. And I want to thank Lana and Jean for your presentations today. I'm a sponge when it comes to this stuff. And my question before on food loss and food waste and what constitutes each was answered, I think, pretty well by you guys today. So I appreciate that. And this is getting into what Tom asked. I think, Tom, you asked about the plastics and stuff, that graph that I think Lana had up there with the measurement for waste in the landfill anyways. Food was 22% and they had plastics pulled out of there. So I'm going to assume myself that they're separating the 2 components there, the food and the plastics and the paper and everything else. But anyways, what my thoughts on this whole thing, I looked at the graph that you had after that, and that had the sewer, wastewater treatment, controlled combustion, landfill, those type things. I see that the landfill is about the largest amount of the wasted food product that we have as an issue. And I just want to throw a comment out there to the work group or to the committee that, maybe one of our, I guess, goals or one of our parts of the charge is to take on that largest piece there, which is the landfill, and the largest amount of waste going to landfills, because it seems like that has a lot of different avenues that a guy could actually take on and make a difference. And maybe I'm way off, but that would be just for a start, I guess. I know there's lots of different things that we can do as far as food loss as well, but just one suggestion. The other thing that I had in mind and I was going to ask you guys about was the education of this type of thing. I believe I'm pretty environmentally aware of things, and I've been starting to do that a lot more, especially with food waste, because I have a garden and I can take out my peelings and throw that stuff out on the garden and use it that way to reuse it, put it in the ground. But when I was a kid, growing up in school, if they had a campaign in school to do something environmentally or whatever, we'd take that home to our parents and I think our parents were nice about it and let us have our little fun experiment and do it. And sometimes those things stuck around. So I do think that education in schools, as far as going to the point where children are introduced to composting. I mean, if we had every household in this great nation composting their food products, byproducts, I think that would make a gigantic difference. I mean, it's unrealistic. I do understand, but to have kids come from school and say, "Mom and Dad, we can do this," and they taught us this in the lunchroom. We threw our plates and our plastics and our stuff in one garbage receptacle, and we put the food in another one, and they took it out and they composted it. And we had this nice soil formed from it after a year of school. Something like that is just something I'm going to throw out there for the work group and the committee as kind of an idea. I guess I just get giddy and happy and excited because I don't know anything about this stuff. And so I just blurt things out. So take it as you may, but just something that I thought of, looking at this stuff and reading over it. I find it very interesting. So I appreciate it.
Any way that you can get happy and giddy at the end of a day is good with me.
I think they're great ideas, Barry, that you brought up, particularly anything that goes in a landfill. All that embedded cost value is just totally wasted unless you tap the landfill for methane.
Okay, Jimmy, you're up next.
Thank you. I also am a newbie about food waste, although I am a parent, so I don't understand it, what happens to the trash can there. But I think this is for Atlanta's presentation. You were talking about food waste management measurements and where you were showing the different decades. And I couldn't help but seeing the 60s, 70s, and 80s were pretty flat. And then all of a sudden, we went crazy in the decade of the 80s and have not got off of that. What is the mechanism there?
I mean, honestly, from that trend, it's probably just the data got better. And I mean, you also see a spike in that. I don't know if I should go back to that slide, but there was also a big spike since 2017, also because we enhanced our methodology and we know that there are more pathways. So we're able to measure more. We know that there's not just those 3 pathways. So honestly, when you look at historical trends, you just have to keep that in mind that we haven't been using the same studies. We've been updating the studies. We have better and new information. And particularly starting this year with our enhanced methodology, we've been able to use better data starting in 2017. So you do see that
all
big
of a sudden
spike.
start raising picky eaters all of a sudden in 1980. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Jeff, you're up. You're on mute, Jeff. Oh, there you go.
There we go. So it's been an interesting journey dealing with this food waste issue because it was something that really went on my radar as well. I knew it was out there a little bit, but as you start talking to people, and I was with EPA and USDA and FDA when they signed the original interagency get together there at the EPA building. You start looking into it, and you start hearing the figures of 30% wasted and things like that. Going into the schools, Barry, you had some great ideas about working with the kids. School cafeterias waste a lot of food, and I went into several schools after getting into this, and you realize that it's a regulatory environment that stops some of that food from going to the next onto the next journey to human consumption. It's either state regulations or infrastructure that keeps that from happening. Talking to many of the school cafeteria administrators, they just don't have the storage facility to put it in, single serve containers to sit at home with kids and that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of opportunities ahead of us in this food waste to address some of this stuff. I took the ultimate sacrifice. I had lunch at several school cafeterias. And what I found out was that when they served food that was identified from local sources, the food waste went down. for some reason, the kids really identified with the local producers and they liked it better. So that was a good thing. So I think there's a lot of challenges, but I think there's so many opportunities, and we've got to look at the state and local and possibly the federal. The ex-stating is a key thing, I think, that we have to look at. But there's a lot of opportunities from what I see from a state regulatory standpoint.
Thank you. Jeanette?
So, I was thinking when you said, Lana, when you're talking about the increase in the retail, on the map, and in the 80s is when the fast food sector just really exploded. And if you look at the trends that they had with their, they used to be like McDonald's, everything was in styrofoam, right? And now, but now that we have the industrial hemp as a product, we're starting to see packaging with that. Do you foresee that as an area that this is going to go into at all?
I mean, I definitely see that as another one of the hot topics, along with plastics and packaging, looking at different types of packaging. We also try to look at that from a sustainable materials management perspective and life cycle perspective. If it's going to increase your costs, and, the packagers are going to have things to consider too. I mean, the packaging serves a purpose. It's preserving the food, it's serving the food, it's hygiene. So there's a lot of factors that would go into it, but we do see that as, and I think USDA had some research too, some new areas that innovation, and we had some research and development innovation challenges and grants and projects that were looking at that specifically, the more natural, biodegradable and or compostable products. And that's another area where we could spend a couple of hours talking about all that terminology and what's biodegradable isn't necessarily compostable, for example, and what that means.
That was going to be my point, was the food safety piece, because I've seen some of this innovation grants, some unique products come forward, and the first thing is how quickly it starts to disintegrate, and I'm thinking it's like almost disintegrating before the product goes. So it's like there has to be some balance there, but yeah.
Right. It has to be functional. It has to protect the product. There's a lot of different things to consider, but using, exploring different sources for that packaging and protecting food products it is a hot topic, and we are hearing a lot more about it and the different innovations and what can be developed to better serve food.
Just an add-on to that, part of the problem why a lot of that food waste goes to the landfills and not to the digesters is farms cannot deal with the packaging. If it were in biodegradable packaging or organics that could be digestible, then a lot of that would move from the landfill to the digester and make energy.
Absolutely. That contamination is an issue that's another area of discussion.
Yep. Dave, you're up next.
Yeah, my question is food recalls where there's contamination, E. coli or whatever it is. Are the tonnage, are those numbers in the food waste numbers you're giving, or are they located somewhere else?
I would think. What do you think, Gina?
Well, I'm just was going to mention they're not directly in the way we estimate food loss at the retail and consumer levels. There are several people at the Economic Research Service that do study food recalls, though, and have estimates on things like that. But no, it's totally separate.
Where would we look for that number?
I'm happy to provide resources for you. I can give you contacts.
I think Gracia was up next, and then Emily. I think you're on mute. There you go.
I'm trying. I just want to ask a little bit more about the issue of cost and value, but in a little different direction. So I don't know in the US, but I know studies in other places like in Brazil and in Europe where they have looked at the economies of an action, such as not taking certain things to the landfill. For example, there is a study in Brazil that for every $4 that they put in water treatment and waste management, they save $12 in health. So is there any, or do you have any data about other ways that money can be saved that then can be applied towards helping
So I don't know about,
farmers or whoever has to do it? Sorry.
yeah, I haven't come across kind of quick facts like that. In particular, our data did have an estimate of, 1 year a family can the loss at the consumer level for a family for is about $1,500. So we do have that, and that's specifically for consumer level.
And other than the criteria of, saving some contamination at the landfill, groundwater, land, air, for removing that, is there any other criteria that that is used in terms of the benefits of the food waste programs that you described?
I mean, so if you want to talk about benefits there's the economic benefits, which we're talking about a little bit here. There's the social benefits of not sending food to the landfill, but you are feeding people with them. And then there are the environmental benefits. So
I'm looking more in the economic side because that's where the resources are going to, from those economies is that the resources are going to come to promote these programs more, so if you have any more data about that, or?
I mean, when we try to equate it, like for our voluntary incentive-based program for the Food Recovery Challenge, those are all those partners are using strategies to divert food waste. When we try to translate it into dollars, it's usually avoided tipping fees. So they manage their waste in a certain way, and they avoided having to pay the tipping fee to send it to the landfill. So they had this savings, and that's usually the closest we can get to that dollar amount what they're saving. But of course, they may have spent additional staff time to do a separation, for example, or they may have spent a certain percentage to manage that stream in a different way, or paid composters a different way. So we usually just try to do a very general landfill tipping fee avoidance when we want to come up with a number. But of course, there are a lot of other factors that would go into it. If there's additional staff time or a different way to manage that waste at that point, if you want to do a separation and composting or donation, there are tax benefits, of course, if you do some donation. But that's usually how we get the dollar amount with the tipping fee avoidance.
But usually that's in a way is all that cost that you were mentioning are really cheaper than if you have the contamination in the landfills.
I mean, the tipping fees, we have some national averages, but it really is location specific. Some states are very cheap to send something to a landfill, and it may be more expensive for an entity to do the composting route. But other parts of the country with the landfill bans and more densely populated areas, the tipping fees could be very expensive. So looking for an alternative way to manage that would save you money, but it depends where you are geographically.
I imagine if you're on an island, it's going to be pretty expensive.
I imagine that it would be, yes.
Emily, you want to round us off for 4:30, and you can have the last question.
Thank you. Actually, if it's okay, I wanted to sort of jump in on that dialogue on the economic benefit and then ask a question that's related. So I think on this point, so Lana mentioned some states have these organic waste, restrictions. So a lot of states in New England, Massachusetts, where I am, as one example. So what Massachusetts has done is said that more than 1 ton, institutions like retailers, businesses can't send more than 1 ton of food waste to the landfill per week. And they did a cost benefit analysis of that afterwards, and they found that the state, and this, again, there's trade-offs in who's paying the cost and who's getting the benefit, but that the state made $175 million in new revenue and created 500 new jobs just because of implementing that policy, because that making that food not be able to go to the landfill meant that it had to be used in other ways. So it built more composting and AD facilities, and also they saw a lot more jobs in food banks and food rescue, and a 22% increase in food donation in the state. And other states that have done these, like Vermont, had similar data as well, New York as well. So I think kind of that gets to the point that Graciela was making as well. Again, it's not necessarily when you look at the individual that's donating or sending that food, diverting it from landfill, it would be great to have really good data. And I think we've also done a lot of looking at landfill tipping fees. And part of, I think, why these have been successful in New England is that landfill tipping fees in New England are high relative to compost or anaerobic digestion tipping fees. And that's not the case necessarily in other parts of the country. I could go on. We did a really big toolkit on these organic waste restrictions in states and localities that we published about a year ago. And then the other thing on the economic piece is that there are really quite good tax benefits for food donation. So right now, those wouldn't apply if food is sent to compost or anaerobic digestion. You would just divert, just have a loss in landfill tipping fees. But if the food is donated, there are strong tax benefits. And one thing we've been talking about for a while that I'd love to talk about more with the committee is that from all of our research, and I'd love also Lana and Jean for you to weigh in on this, that farmers don't typically benefit from those tax deductions, even though they technically are eligible for them, because they're kind of complicated and because deductions sometimes are hard for farmers to claim because they don't necessarily make a lot of money. So one thing that we've talked about with other farmers in the past too is maybe a credit instead of a deduction. It's not something that could be done by agencies, but potentially there's some other incentive that could be really targeted towards farmers, knowing that right now they don't get as much there's not as much of a incentive for them to donate as opposed to plow material under or send to landfill. But I wanted the question, which relates to all this, I think, and relates to the point that Jeff made earlier, was just I'd love to know the framework for how at EPA you work with states around some of these regulations like organic waste bans, or if a state is thinking about some of those regulatory opportunities. And I know it's not the way that EPA has approached this, but I'm curious, are there, is there technical assistance to states about doing that, or incentives to states to think about their regulations and make this, align incentives or make it easier to divert food from landfill? Sorry for the long-winded response, Matt. I hope that was okay.
Well, do you want to respond, Lana or Jean?
I mean, I can talk a little bit. Our regional representatives, which I mentioned several times, they're really the heart of a lot of the work that we do, and they do have those close relationships with the states as they're developing different policies. I know in the New England states, our Region 1 representatives, worked closely with them, and I know you probably have also worked with Chris too. So she works very closely with the states when they're developing things, and I think our Region 2 office, it's not the same across the board. We participate and offer that technical assistance when we're invited or when we're asked to help convene the groups, but many of our regional representatives are closely involved with our states. And then we work with the state organizations like the Association of State and Territorial Solid Waste Management Officials, or Environmental Council of States, our different state organizations where we would work closely with and participate in their meetings, and again, offer updates and technical advice and resources as they become available.
So I agree with Emily. You know, what you're saying is right about the tax incentives for farmers may not be sufficient to cover their harvesting and getting the produce or whatever to the food bank. So that's why they'll just plow it under. And I do want to emphasize, you know, in order to meet this national goal, we're going to have to do really bold and big ideas like what you're talking about with tax credits, you know, making regulatory changes that can really move the needle. So I love hearing good ideas like that.
Well, I'd like to thank both Jean and Lana for their talk today, and I think it was very informative. It sure did help me. And I would just want to thank you both very much. And I'm turning it back over to Tom to finish up the day.
Matt, thank you. Jean and Lana, before you go, I've got one question myself, and that is, are there any pilot projects, NEFA grants or ARS grants where we're looking at diverting food waste, say from a landfill, more into a livestock feed? I know in some of the major metropolitan areas, you'd have enough to probably get a large enough supply, but is there anything being looked at to process that, stabilize that waste such that it could be put on a train and sent to the central part of the U.S. for livestock feed or something like that?
Right. And offhand, I don't know, but if you email me that question, I can forward it to somebody, a contact at NIFA that I have and a contact that I have at ARS, and they can provide an answer for their own agencies. I don't know their whole inventory of their projects.
Great.
No way. So.
All right.
I'm not aware of any at EPA right now.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much for a great presentation, great information, and thank you for being with us today. Matt, thank you for facilitating the discussion and all the work that you and the work group have done to get us to this point. So with that, we will wrap up this session, and that brings us almost to the end of the day. Now, don't anybody jump off, because we've still got our public comment session.
I will sign off, and thank you so much. I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk to all of you. If you have any questions in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out. So have a good afternoon and evening. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jean. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I'll leave too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Guys, we've had a fabulous conversation today. We had outstanding speakers that brought us good information. We've got a lot more now to consider and think about in our work groups as we're considering our advice to EPA. Tomorrow, we've got a full agenda. We'll actually have one more speaker for the food waste, and that will be refed, which should be a very good discussion. And then we'll finish up our committee discussion on food waste. Following that, we'll have our entire pesticide discussion, and Lauren Lurkins will lead that discussion. Again, thank you to the committee members and members of the public for your perseverance. It's not easy to sit through a 6-hour virtual committee meeting, 6-hour meeting of any kind, but this is tough, and we've had short breaks. Y'all have done great, and I appreciate it. I am going to kick it over to Rebecca. She's got a few more housekeeping items for the committee, and then we'll be going to our public comment.
Thank you, Chairman McDonald. So I just wanted to remind and encourage the public that's watching this that if you were inspired by any of the conversations that were had today or the presentations, to please consider submitting feedback to the committee at rrcc@epa.gov to that email. We are accepting any feedback between now and 11:59 p.m. tomorrow. And so with that, I will turn it back over to you, Chairman McDonald.
Thank you, Rebecca. Scott, are you on the meeting?
Yes, I am here and I can hear you.
All right, thank you. So Scott Yeager from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association has signed up to give public comment. So I will turn it over to you, Scott. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman McDonald and Vice Chair Lurkins. Appreciate the opportunity to come speak with you all here today. I know you've had a long day, but I'm going to try to keep my comments as concise and as close to the 3 minutes that I'm allotted. I represent the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. NCBA is the nation's oldest and largest trade association representing the beef cattle industry. And I am the Chief Environmental Counsel and wanted to talk with you all about a really important issue. In fact, Jamie mentioned it earlier during the water working group. And I just wanted to take some time to talk a little bit more about the recent Supreme Court groundwater decision, because I think there is a need and opportunity for the agricultural community and the FRRCC specifically to engage in this conversation as it develops over the next several years. So in April of 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision finding that a groundwater discharge to waters of the United States, or WOTUS, can be regulated pursuant to the Clean Water Act if the groundwater discharge is the functional equivalent of a direct discharge. So this Supreme Court decision was authored by Justice Breyer and joined by 5 other Supreme Court justices. And basically what it says is, to be regulated by the Clean Water Act, a groundwater discharge has to meet this 7-part test, okay? And I'm going to go through the 7-part test. I'm going to be quick, but I want you to hear what's in it. So number 1 is transit. Number 2 is the distance traveled. Again, think about groundwater and nutrients as a potential pollutant traveling from an agricultural operation to waters of the U.S. So think about it through that dynamic, right? So transit, distance traveled, the nature of the material through which pollutant travels, the extent to which pollutant is diluted or chemically changed as it travels, the amounts of pollutant that leaves the point source, the manner by or area in which the pollutant enters navigable waters, and the degree to which the pollution, when it reaches navigable waters, has maintained its specific identity. That's a lot of words. You might be wondering what all that means. Basically, that is the Supreme Court kicking the can back to the federal government to figure out how to regulate groundwater discharges, okay? So the Supreme Court has said, in this case, so specifically in this Maui case, it's about a wastewater treatment facility that was discharging pollutants into these injection wells that then the pollution migrated from the injection wells into the Pacific Ocean. So it was really a bad set of facts that the Supreme Court couldn't say, no, we don't want this regulated. But in issuing this decision and with the 7-part test, it opens the door to a vast array of different operations being regulated by this new Supreme Court decision. So I raise it here because it's important for agriculture. Agriculture is not targeted specifically in the decision, but the implications in the outcome of Maui could have ripple effects across all different regulated entities, including agriculture. So the practical impact is that the decision effectively overturns 2019 guidance from EPA that found that effectively that groundwater discharges are excluded from the scope of NPDES permitting, even where the pollutants are conveyed to a jurisdictional surface water. So this decision overturns that EPA guidance and puts the ball back in the EPA's court to figure out where to go from here, given this 7-part test that Justice Breyer developed. Okay, so right now, many states already impose limitations on discharges to groundwater that go above and beyond the federal NPDES requirements. Agricultural producers in those states will see no or little change to their permits or permitting requirements. But in states where there are no existing groundwater discharge regulations, there may be change based upon what the EPA does here in the coming years that will trickle down to the state EPAs and then be implemented at your level. So it's an important issue. And then, so here's a concrete example. With the CAFO regulations, under the Clean Water Act, CAFOs are point sources. And if you're a CAFO, you need to figure out if you are discharging to Otis. And if you are, you need a permit. But if you don't meet that size threshold to be a CAFO and you're smaller than that, you're a non-point source. But what I fear is that this decision opens the door to some of those smaller operations, those smaller animal feeding operations, to now be regulated by virtue of nutrients and pollutants trickling through the soil and eventually into waters of the U.S. So that's one example, and then you can go on from there. There's other ways that could implicate agriculture. So my recommendation is that the agricultural community work with the EPA to ensure that the Clean Water Act's statutory exclusions for agricultural stormwater and irrigation runoff are upheld and honored by the government in light of the County of Maui decision, right? So also NCBA's request is that EPA define and differentiate something like a wastewater treatment injection well, which was at issue in the County of Maui decision, distinguish that from diffuse groundwater flow that carries passive non-point source discharges to navigable water. So that's the type of stuff you'll see in agricultural operations where you're applying manure to row crops, for example, and maybe some of that goes below the root zone of the plant and ends up in the groundwater, and that eventually is going to end up in a federally regulated water. So there should be a legal distinction between that and a wastewater treatment facility that's purposefully injecting pollutants into the ground. So that is kind of my pitch to you all. I think it's an issue that's ripe for the EPA to expound on in the coming months and years. They might do it through development of guidance. They might do it through promulgating an official federal rulemaking. But as that happens, I would urge you all as agricultural producers and people who work in the agricultural field to be aware of it and to be a voice at the table as those discussions happen. So I appreciate the time to be here and speak with you. Congratulations on making it all the way through the first day. And I will pass the microphone back to Chairman Tom.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate your public comment. Is there anything else that any of the committee members would like to bring before our meeting today? I see no hands going up, so I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
So moved.
So move.
We've got several. I got Sharon Furches. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Beth Sauerhaft. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, we are officially adjourned. We will see you in the morning get on a little bit before 10 o'clock, just so we can make sure that we've got everybody, the technology's working and we're ready to go right at 10 o'clock. Get on at 9:45 or something like that, Eastern. No.
Central.
10:45 Eastern time. I'm sorry.
Ooh, hold on now. Now I say 6:45 a.m. Y'all are making this nice and exciting.
I've already made the conversion. I'm in Central time.
That we start at 11, right?
We start at 11 Eastern.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry. I've got everybody totally confused now.
Have a good night.
11 o'clock Eastern. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome again to the U.S. EPA's Farm, Ranch, and Rural Communities Advisory Committee meeting agenda, the second day of this November 11th and November 12th and 13th meeting. If you have any issues with your webcast that you're viewing, there is a tech support link above the video player window. And we also want to let everybody know that this will be archived. If you've missed any of it, it will be archived for later viewing on the FRRCC website. So I'm going to turn it over to the chair now, Mr. Tom McDonald. Tom?
Thanks, Dave. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the EPA Farm, Ranch, and Rural Communities Advisory Committee meeting. I am Tom McDonald, Senior Vice President of Environmental Affairs and Sustainability for Five Rivers Cattle Feeding and Chairman of the FRRCC. I want to welcome back all the members of the committee and those members of the public that are viewing our meeting via the webcast that's being broadcast. We're going to begin this morning with a roll call of the FRRCC committee members. I will call your name, and if you would tell us who you're representing, what your affiliation is. So we'll begin with Michael Arts.
Morning, everyone. Mike Arts, Director of Science and Regulatory Affairs at Florida Fruit and Vegetable Association, and also representing the Minor Crop Farmer Alliance.
Thank you, Mike. Barry Berg.
Present. Barry Berg, representing East Dakota Water Development, work for East Dakota Water Development District, representing local government.
Thank you. Emily Broadleib.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Emily Broadleib. I'm with the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic. I'm representing academia.
Thanks, Emily. Commissioner Don Brown. Don, you're on mute. There.
That better? Thank
better.
you very much, Tom. Don Brown, Yuma, Colorado, farmer and rancher. And I'm present, by the way, after I unmute.
Thanks, Don. Jamie Burr. I don't believe Jamie is going to be with us today. Mr. Philip Chavez.
Hey, good morning. Philip Chavez, representing the Lower Arkansas River Water Conservancy District, and also a farmer here in Southeast Colorado and Yuma, Arizona.
Thanks, Philip. John Collison. And I believe I got a note that John would not be able to be with us today as well. I just wanted to make sure he hadn't joined. Bill Cowser.
Bill Cowser, Nevada, Iowa, Cowser Cattle Company. I'm a farmer feeder here representing livestock, ethanol, soil health, and water quality.
Thank you, Bill. Michael Crowder.
I'm here, Mr. Chair. Thank you. And I'm representing the National Association of Conservation Districts, and I'm from West Richland, Washington State.
Thank you very much. Matt Frund.
I'm here, Mr. Chairman. I represent Dairy Farm and Farm Markets, and I'm in Connecticut.
Thanks, Matt. Sharon Furches.
I'm here. I'm representing Kentucky Farm Bureau, and I'm also a farmer in far western Kentucky with Purchase Farms Partnership.
Thank you, Sharon. Jeff Gore.
I'm here. I'm a research and extension entomologist with Mississippi State University, located in Stoneville, Mississippi, and I'm representing academia.
Thank you for being with us today, Jeff. David Graybill.
I'm Dave Graybill, Central Pennsylvania, Mifflintown. I represent dairy farmers.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Alex Johns. We got a message earlier from Alex as well. He's trying to get cattle to higher grounds and keep homes from flooding. So Florida's getting the rainfall again. Jimmy Kinder.
Good morning. Representing Oklahoma Farm Bureau. I'm a farmer and rancher from Southwest Oklahoma. Already put in 3 calves this morning before the meeting, so we're good.
All right. Thanks, Jimmy. Jeanette Lombardo. Jeanette, are you with us? Are you on mute? Okay. The Vice Chairman of our FRRCC, Ms. Lauren Lurkins.
I am present. I'm Lauren Lurkins, the Director of Environmental Policy, representing Illinois Farm Bureau. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Gary Mahaney.
I'm here, Mr. Chairman, representing New York and our farm
We're located 50 miles straight south of Rochester, New York.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Nick McCarthy.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I am here. I'm representing Central Valley Ag Cooperative and our 15,000 member owners that are farmers and ranchers.
Thank you, Nick. Jesse McCurry.
Yes, sir. I'm present. Good morning. I represent Kansas grain sorghum farmers.
Thank you, Jesse. Jay Olson.
Present, representing local and state governments. I work for the Utah Department of Ag and Food and am a full-time farmer. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us, Jay. Mr. Chris Pettit.
Good morning, Tom. Chris Pettit, State Agencies, Office of Ag Water Policy from Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Mr. Bill Proct.
Bill Proct from Farmer Rancher from Westphalia, Kansas. Also CEO of East Kansas Agri-Energy Ethanol Plant in Garnett, Kansas, representing agriculture and the ethanol industry.
Thanks, Bill. Dr. Graciela Ramirez Toro.
Good morning. Graciela Ramirez Toro, representing academia. I work at Inter-American University of Puerto Rico, directing the Center for Environmental Education, Conservation, and Research.
Thank you, Graciela. Appreciate you being with us. Dr. Beth Sauerhaft.
Good morning. My name is Beth Sauerhaft. I'm here in metropolitan New York, representing the Ag and Environmental NGO community. I'm the Vice President of Programs for the American Farmland Trust.
Thanks, Beth. Appreciate you being with us. Stacy Smith. Don't believe Stacy is with us today. Mr. Davey Stevens.
Good morning, Tom. Farmer from Clinton, Kentucky, representing the American Soybean Association as chair.
Thanks, Davey. Secretary Jeff Whitty.
Good morning. I'm present and I serve as New Mexico Secretary of Agriculture.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Jeff. Amy Wolf.
Good morning, everyone, from beautiful Modesto, California. I am the President and CEO Emeritus of AgSafe, representing agricultural nonprofit organizations.
Thanks, Amy. Jim Zook.
Good morning. Jim Zook, I'm present, and I represent the Michigan Corn Growers Association of Michigan and Michigan Corn Marketing Program. Also, our 4 operating ethanol plants in the state of Michigan as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I show we've got 27 members present. We do have a quorum, so I will call to order the Farm, Ranch, and Rural Communities Committee.
Excuse me, Tom.
Yes.
You missed me on the roll call. This is Charlie Santerra, Purdue University, and I represent academia.
I am sorry, Charlie. I did not mean to jump over you. Thanks for chiming in. So we'll begin today with a continuation of our discussion on food loss and waste. Yesterday, we heard from Lana Suarez and Dr. Gene Busby. They gave us a good overview of EPA's role on food waste and presented information concerning economics related to food loss and waste. Today, I would like to introduce Matt Frund. Matt is the chair of the Food Loss and Waste Ad Hoc Work Group. And after we have our speakers, Matt will be leading the discussion on food waste today. So without that, without any further ado, we will go straight to our first speaker. Dana, are you with us? I just want to make sure.
I'm with you, yes. Hello. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you. Our first speaker this morning is Dana Gunders. Dana is Executive Director of ReFed, a nonprofit focused on advancing data-driven solutions to U.S. food waste. She has dedicated her career to helping industry, policymakers, and consumers identify and activate solutions to reduce food waste. Her landmark 2012 report, Wasted: How America is Losing Up to 40% of its food from farm to fork to landfill, sounded a clarion call to about the consequences of food waste. And since then, she has continued to bring the issue to a wider audience. So Dana, thank you for being with us this morning. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be speaking to this committee, and I'm actually really looking forward to hearing what you come up with as your final advice, because I think you have a real challenge before you of sort of taking, the very broad and complex world of agriculture and looking at where EPA specifically has jurisdiction and influence and trying to combine those. So I'll be very curious and really look forward to the discussion. I actually have been working on this issue of food loss and waste for about 10 years now. And it began when I was working on a project with the fruit and vegetable industry in California, and actually nationally, as part of a project called the Stewardship Index for Specialty Crops. And what we were trying to do was create metrics for the specialty crop industry to measure water use, energy use, and other resource use in the same way. And so that we could create kind of a more of a discussion and understanding of how, what's going well and what's not. I was put in charge of the waste group at the time. And really that group was meant to look at like irrigation piping and plastics and what to do with all of that. But as I started to research more, I was stumbling across these numbers that I found shocking, such as 40% of food never gets eaten. And, 20% of the water in this country is going to grow food that ultimately never gets eaten and things like that. And I felt like, wow, here we are, trying to improve water efficiency by 5 or 10%. And yet, on the other hand, all that food is never even, almost half of the food isn't getting eaten. And so that really drove me to investigate further, speak with growers, speak with processors, and kind of vet these numbers. And they all went, yeah, that's probably about right. But it sort of seemed just to be an accepted component of the food system. And I think that's where I saw a real parallel to energy efficiency. And I felt like, in energy, there's been a lot of focus on reducing demand, in addition to things like renewables, solar, wind power, things like that. But in the food sector, there has not been a close look, or this is 10 years ago, at how do we make sure that we're really making the best use of all the food that we grow. And that is really what spurred me to start working on this topic. And with that, I will share my screen. So I lead an organization called ReFed. We are a national nonprofit whose goal is to end food loss and waste across the food system by advancing data-driven solutions to the problem. And we do that we really focus on 3 different aspects of that. We provide data and insights to the issue. We mobilize capital, and that is private investment, philanthropic capital, as well as public funding to come into the space and fund some of the innovation that needs to happen to make improvement on this issue. And lastly, we do stakeholder engagement. We really are a connector in the space. We hold the country's biggest food waste summit, actually in partnership with one of your own, Emily Broad-Lieb, on the call. And we do quite a bit to try to bring people together for collaboration, which is so needed in this work because it's such a systems level problem. Our three strategies for this are really to motivate more people to get engaged with the topic, both through the data and through communications. And then once they're engaged, we really want to drive them to act and do that through whatever means necessary, whether that's bringing more capital to the space or driving collaboration or helping support innovation that's happening. And lastly, we try to break down some of the barriers and that exist and some of those structural disincentives that are out there. So I know you got some background on the topic yesterday. I won't spend too much time doing this again, but just to kind of level set and make sure we're all on the same page. So about 40% of food goes uneaten. I would say really it's kind of 30 to 40%, depending on how you measure it. We get those numbers. The value of that food is about $218 billion that ultimately is not getting eaten. And of course, meanwhile, that is happening alongside a huge spike right now in food insecurity due to the pandemic. There's an estimate that about 50 million Americans are actually considered food insecure at this point. That's about 1 in 7. Deeply concerning, I'm sure, to the EPA are the environmental impacts and the resource use that is going towards growing this food that ultimately is not eaten. So from a greenhouse gas perspective, food waste is actually, the footprint of it is worth about 8% of all global emissions is going to food that doesn't get eaten. Actually, for this reason, there's a project called Project Drawdown that has looked at 76 solutions to climate change, and they have ranked reducing food waste the #1 solution above solar energy, wind power, electric cars, you name it. That is the scale of the potential this has in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see all of the other resource use that is being dedicated to growing this food that ultimately isn't eaten. And finally, landfill volume, a place where EPA actually does have quite a bit of jurisdiction. And I think one of the key drivers to their interest in this topic is that more food goes to landfill than any other product. So it's kind of, in my mind, adding insult to injury there. But the flip side of that is that there's a huge opportunity here. And I think when I look at this issue, what I see is actually like this win-win-win in a lot of ways. When food is not being wasted, if you take all that food that's currently going to waste and you do something better with it, there's the potential to recover almost 2 billion meals, trillions of gallons of water, 18 million tons of greenhouse gases, and billions of dollars, both for consumer savings as well as further up in the supply chain. So I know I was asked to cover kind of this what seems like an obvious question, but is actually very complicated, and that is, what is food waste? And I will tell you that in the community of geeks that work on this, this is kind of an enduring debate, that this term food waste is so riddled with problems. Certainly nobody wants to donate food waste to be eaten, right? That doesn't sound very appealing. And there's also the question of, well, if the animals eat it, does that count? If it, goes to compost, does that count? Is it really waste? So just acknowledging this term, I've been working on this decade. This debate has been going on for a decade. And I think the challenge is that the term is very sticky. People really grab onto it and use it. At the same time, it's using that word waste is a challenge. So I wanted to go through that with you in a couple ways. I'm sure Lana showed you this yesterday, which is the EPA's food recovery hierarchy, which really talks about, that what we're after here is not having a huge volume of surplus food generated. That is kind of the best case scenario. And only once we've done everything we can to stop that should we start thinking about, okay, well, now we do have the food that's surplus. Let's feed it to hungry people. Let's feed it to animals. Let's find other ways of using it, compost it, anaerobic digestion. And only then, after we've exhausted all those opportunities, should we send it to landfill or incineration. My point here on the right is the U.S., I'm sure you heard yesterday also that EPA, USDA, and FDA have a joint goal of reducing food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. To clarify, that goal is about landfill and incineration. So the goal is really to reduce what is going to landfill and incineration by 50% by 2030. So if you take something that was going to landfill and now you're composting it, that counts towards the goal. If you kind of don't produce that in the first place, that also counts towards the goal. So they're measuring that by looking at the volumes going into landfills and trying to cut that in half. And that's just to clarify what their definition is there. Again, to get a little wonky here, there's actually, like I said, been a lot of discussion around this definition. So what we're looking at now is an international protocol. It's called the Food Loss and Waste Protocol. This was created by the same group, the World Resources Institute, along with many, many other stakeholders, but they're the ones who created the protocol for greenhouse gas accounting. So any company that is currently accounting for their greenhouse gas footprint is using a protocol created by this same organization. And when this organization got into seeing the impacts of food waste and all the confusion, they said we need something similar to clarify what we're talking about. So what we have here is the way that they've gone about this is to say, okay, we don't really have food waste, right? We have food, and then we have its inedible parts. We have kind of what can be eaten, and then we have the peels and the bones and the skins that cannot be eaten, but are kind of a part of producing the food. And then we have where it goes. And in the international definition, and there are a suite of groups and countries that have committed to an international goal, and that goal has been set by the UN, by the United Nations. That goal, similar to the US, is to reduce food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. However, they have a different definition, just to keep things interesting, right? So what you are looking at is the international interpretation of that term. And so what they're saying is anything with a check mark next to it here counts as loss and waste. So in their measurement, if something goes to composting, it does not count towards that 50% reduction goal. It is still counted as waste. If it goes to anaerobic digestion, if it's applied on lands, if it was grown but not harvested, all of that in the international interpretation does not count towards the 50% reduction. The only thing that counts are not producing it in the first place, donating it to people and recovering it for human consumption, or feeding it to animals, and biomaterial processing, which are industrial uses like rendering, for instance. If we keep going, just to send the point home here, the US has a different definition. And so for the US, the only things that count towards waste are those that are circled here. Anything else in this whole list actually counts towards their goal. So I just wanted to clarify that for everyone, since it can get a little bit confusing. A quick question here. Do we want to stop and take questions as we go? Or should I just kind of keep going? And because this might be a good place for questions if we want to run it that way.
I think let's go through the presentation, and then we'll have questions at the end.
Okay, sounds good. So back in 2014, actually, a group got together before ReFed was an organization, and we said, you know, a lot of people are worried about this food loss and waste problem. It's not actually, the numbers are so staggering, it's not hard to get people's attention. But the question is now, what do you do about it? And so that is what led to ReFed producing a roadmap back in 2016 that looked at 27 different solutions to food loss and waste and evaluated those solutions for how much food they saved and how much they cost or saved in dollars, or often it was cost and saved in dollars, right? And where that landed financially. To do this, we had to look at a baseline of actually how much is going to waste in the first place to evaluate the reduction. And to note, back to those definitions, in ReFed's report, we considered things like composting as diverting from landfill. So they were included as a solution in our analysis. So to give a sense of just like where this is happening, right? If you look at the supply chain, very heavily weighted towards the later parts of the supply chain. About 40% happening in households, and then another 40% happening in consumer-facing businesses, which, as you can see down here, includes everything from the grocery store, restaurants, and then food service, which is, hospitals and corporate cafeterias, universities, and then on down. And the analysis that was done, I should clarify, looked at produce only. So this might be the time to mention that there has been very little analysis of losses at the production level for animal ag and for commodity crops. It's just something that hasn't been done yet. So when I hear about your group, it's something I would love to see someone, whether it's USDA or EPA, take on in a more detailed way. I think the general thinking has been there isn't that much that's lost kind of at production. You have, generally most fields are harvested fully, given that it's like an automated harvest system for commodity crops. And then in animal ag, you guys could tell me far better than I could tell you that you're really mostly looking at mortality, which no one wants in the first place. So it's a little bit of a different story than in specialty crops, where you have a situation where a field can get harvested and yet there is actually still a lot of edible product left behind in the field. You also have situations where there's, because the prices are so volatile, that you'll have walk-bys where fields do not get harvested because of low market pricing. But just to emphasize, this quantity is looking at fruit and vegetable only. And that's true here. So if you look at where is the value of what's getting thrown out, a lot of it, of course, the food is gaining value as it goes along. So even if it were the same volume, this would look higher in the homes, but then you add on those volumes and you see that, a lot of the economic loss that's happening from this is happening later in the supply chain. But that's not to say there's nothing happening on farms, and $15 billion is not really, anything to sneeze at. So still, I think a big opportunity to look at in ag. So I know this is a lot to look at here. These are the 27 solutions that ReFed analyzed in its original roadmap. And it wasn't so much that I wanted to stop on the specific solutions, but I did just want to walk you through. If you can see up here, these are screenshots from our website, which I invite you to go to at refed.com, refed.com, because you can play around a little bit. And you can click on these tabs, and you'll see that how the different solutions do really changes as you go through. So if you're looking at net financial benefit, that is all the costs and all the savings, regardless of who pays and who saves, you have solutions like consumer education campaigns and standardized date labeling, packaging adjustments really topping the list. But if you're looking at tons of waste, if your goal is to get tons out of the landfill, then you're looking at some of these other solutions that are happen a little later in food's life around composting, anaerobic digestion, because they can just take so many tons. If you're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, you get a little bit of a different story again, that sort of is somewhere in between those two, where you have things like waste tracking really looking pretty good. And that's because waste tracking is what it achieves is that prevention, right? It prevents businesses from having surplus food in the first place. And I should note that in that whole hierarchy that the EPA created, preventing food from going to waste, part of the reason it's the preferable solution is that it's the one with the biggest bang for buck when it comes to resource use. And so certainly from a greenhouse gas perspective, there's about an 8 times more of a benefit preventing food from being wasted than there is in composting it, to give you a sense. So what I just showed you was our former roadmap. We are actually looking forward to in January, and I don't know the timeframe of your committee's recommendation process, but we are in the process of conducting a much more extensive analysis right now. And unfortunately, we don't have our results yet to share, but I did want to just give you a little bit of a peek at what we're doing in case it's relevant and fits within your time frame. So our new analysis will be quantifying the problem. So we'll be looking at how much food is going to waste, but giving people the ability to dive in much more deeply into how that breaks down. So you'll be able to go in and look at not only how much food is going to waste and how it breaks down by sector, but also by food type, by reasons as to why it's happening, and then you'll be able to, and by state, I should say. You'll also be able to look at how much, not only in tons, but similar to the charts I just showed you, you'll be able to look at how much is happening, ranked by, greenhouse gas emissions, value, and water footprint. In addition, we'll be looking at a bunch of solutions. We have about 40 solutions that we've analyzed this time, and there will be the ability to customize. So instead of seeing a bunch of solutions that don't apply to you, you'll be able to see some, kind of say, I'm a producer, show me the ones that apply to me. And then we also will have an entire financial analysis, both of how much investment is needed and what the potential value of the return might be. And we'll have other fun things like a directory of 700 organizations that are providing services in this space, as well as an impact calculator that you can go on and play around with to see the impact of both food going to landfill, but also all of those other destinations. This was so much information, and I really wanted to stop here and spend a little time on this with you. What we're doing in our analysis has been so much that we felt the need to kind of boil it down to what are we really trying to tell people. And that led us to develop this, which is going to be called our Roadmap to 2030. So there's a little bit of a sneak preview of what we are launching in January. And we took actually we have 80 solutions that we looked at. We were only able to model 40 of them. But we have 80 different solutions, and we put them all into categories, and we came out with these 7 themes. And I think this really captures kind of what we think is the pathway towards achieving that 50% goal and reducing food loss and waste. And I will click one more time to get you through to some definitions. I think where you're focused is here in optimize the harvest. One thing you'll note about these 7 is that we really tried to articulate what we mean by preventing food from going to waste in more specificity than we've seen done before, because we often get that question of like, okay, what does that even mean? So In here, we start by saying, let's optimize the harvest. Let's try to avoid overproduction, and then kind of right size production, and then harvest as much as possible, get as much of what we have produced off the field. When it comes to supply chains, we're really looking at the potential of different technologies to help reduce not just losses that are happening in supply chains, but essentially lead towards shorter and better maintained systems that can increase freshness and therefore reduce losses later in the supply chain. So technologies like intelligent routing, for instance, that routes product according to its shelf life, so that shorter shelf life product actually gets routed closer and longer shelf life further. Using sensors and temperature monitors to make some of those decisions and things like that. When we look at refining product management, that is really about businesses buying, trying to as closely as possible match sales with match demand, supply and demand, right? And so that businesses are not over purchasing and winding up with a lot of extra product. We know how challenging this is. The average grocery store has about 50,000 SKUs that they're managing on any given day. And so really difficult to predict that. And there's some new tools coming out that, for instance, use artificial intelligence to help identify patterns in behaviors, purchasing behaviors that can help reduce overpurchasing in retail, for instance. But also, in addition to that, in this category, we're looking at secondary resale channels. And of course, that's something we saw during the pandemic. Those outlets, those places that had a few different channels lined up for sales did much better than those who had only one, typically. And so, having that flexibility, knowing that there are going to be times when there's surplus, and having a secondary resale channel lined up is a really successful strategy. Next, maximizing product utilization. That is really about once you own the product, once you have it, making sure you're using as much of it as possible. I love that we use everything but the squeal kind of mentality. That's what this is about, whether it's animal products, vegetables, or just making sure, or a catering facility that is not just producing extra pans of something when they don't need to be. Also in this category is something that may be of interest to you, and maybe you have or have not heard this term. It's kind of new and hot, called upcycling. But there is quite a bit of innovation happening right now. In fact, a trade association just formed around this and has, over 100 members already. And what this is taking often byproducts from manufacturing and converting them into food products. So you have, for instance, companies that are taking spent grains from breweries and actually manufacturing that into a flour. You have companies that are taking bananas that don't make the spec cut and drying them and producing snack products with them. You have companies taking juicing pulp and going through a process to convert those into chips or snacks. So lots of creativity and I would say product innovation happening in this space as well. Reshaping consumer environments. So as you saw, there is a lot going to waste in that household and consumer environment category. And there's also a lot we can do. There's some that is about directly connecting with consumers and driving, better food management behaviors that lead them to waste less in their households. Of course, behavior change is a huge challenge. And so the other way to go about this is to kind of change the environment that consumers are operating in a little bit in a way that leads them to waste less naturally. So an example of that would be meal kits, for instance. Meal kits are something, perhaps you've tried them. Blue Apron is probably the best known, but they're They're businesses that are sending meals to people, not cooked meals. They're sending ingredients to cook meals to people's homes, and then people are cooking those meals. They're sending just the right amount of ingredients. And so what those are really doing is a lot of the behaviors that we want consumers to do to reduce waste in their home, like planning your meals, using shopping lists, not buying too much at the store, those sorts of things. The meal kits are kind of doing that for consumers. And so that would be an example of a way that we can help people waste less in their homes without really asking them to sacrifice anything. And then the last two on this list are big, though they're last. One is about strengthening food rescue, different ways that we can increase and improve the amount of food that's going to donation right now and food assistance. And then lastly, recycle anything remaining. And that would include everything from animal feed to composting, anaerobic digestion, industrial uses. One kind of up and coming thing that's happening in this category is what they call insect farming. And that is taking typically like a very consistent feedstock from, say, a manufacturing facility of byproduct and actually growing black flies on them, but just the larvae of black flies. And that larvae can be turned into animal feed and used as a feed product. So that's kind of one up and coming exciting thing. I think the first large industrial kind of factory of this was just built in the Netherlands. So I think, one thing that we're seeing as we're going through this analysis at that level of optimize the harvest, I think we just need to be kind of really upfront about what is and isn't true. So when we look at net financial benefit, it's low. What we see generally at the farm level, and I should caveat this, that we are still stuck in the place of only using specialty crops. So we are, when I'm talking right now, it's actually really just about the fruit and vegetable industry. And what we see there is that there are a lot of tons that could be gotten out of the field right now. However, the financials around it are not very convincing right now. They're fairly low. And yet the climate mitigation potential is kind of somewhere in the middle. It's not the highest, it's not the lowest. What that tells me is that, at least in some cases, likely this is a place where we can't expect an individual grower to make a poor business decision if the financial benefit isn't there, right? And so this is likely a place where we may want to look to public funding, if it's in the public's interest to get that food out of the field, but it's not in the, it doesn't really pencil out for the grower themselves. To me, that says this is probably a place, at least in some cases, where public funding or perhaps philanthropic funding should be coming in and helping pay for getting that food out of the field. And I think that's, to me, what kind of this combination of low, high, medium says is that in some cases, it kind of just doesn't pay, and we need to be clear about that, and then we need to just make it pay with a different equation. There are other cases where it actually is paying. There's a company called Imperfect Produce and another one called Misfit Markets. Both of them are buying up what they're calling imperfect, kind of off-grade, off-spec produce from growers in the industry. And I mean, they are blowing up. Their sales increased 40% during this pandemic. They were a great outlet for some of those growers who were providing to the food service market and kind of lost their market. And they each of those companies during this pandemic in the last few months have received, one received $85 million in funding from investment. The other just got a $75 million investment. So clearly, there's somebody's looking at this going, this does work financially, and it's actually a really good model. Those companies are delivering direct to consumer. So just a note there. But I think there are other cases where it doesn't work out, and let's find mechanisms to make it work. I just wanted to give you a sense of I can't provide the modeling yet, a sense of some of the solutions that we're looking at the ag level. Again, specialty crop has really been our window. We do hope, I should mention that next year we hope to expand to include several other product categories, if possible. But for now, looking at the specialty crop industry, kind of we have our solutions into 3 categories here. Those that are kind of just best practices we know people are doing to some extent, but maybe worth another look to make sure you're doing them as best as possible, around sanitation and harvesting schedules. Modeled solutions are often about how do we get that product kind of out of the field. That's, can we expand the specifications for some of these products? So for those who aren't familiar, when a retailer is buying apples, they're specifying, we want USDA grade fancy, but then plus 20% red or plus this, and they often layer on additional specs. That, of course, is not how every apple grows in the field. And so that excludes a bunch of product. For something like apples, there's a lot of different markets for lower grade product, but for something like cucumbers, there are not. And so, we see an opportunity for, in certain product categories, those specs to be just slightly expanded in a way that might allow for more product to fit and to get harvested. Partial order acceptance is, right now, if a load gets rejected, the entire load gets rejected. But could there be a way where, and there's been some work on this, where, 30% of the load gets accepted or 70% of the load gets accepted, and then you just have 30% rejected. Gleaning is where you have volunteers going out into fields, and then the imperfect product lines are what I was just mentioning. And then over here on the unmodeled side, we have not necessarily been able to get data here, but there are, I think, other potential promising things to look at. One I want to call out specifically are innovative grower contracts and improved communication for planting schedules. And this is something we've heard time and time again from growers, is that they are essentially really under the contracts. They essentially often are growing a little bit more than they need to be because they need to meet their contracts, and they want to essentially insure for that. And then on a good year, that can lead to 10 to 20% overproduction, and that's where you get bumper supplies and tanking prices and a lot of fields getting walked by. We think there's a room for more flexibility in those contracts that could be explored, as well as the model that's been put out there and just tried a little bit, called whole field purchasing, which is something that's happening in the UK quite a bit. Tesco's really implementing this, where they commit to buying an entire field of product. And so, they will buy the grade 1s, but they'll also buy the lower grades, and they'll work with processors to then take those lower grades and convert them to other products. But it allows for essentially better sharing of risk across grower and buyer communities, because right now if we're honest about what's happening, all of the risk is on the grower. The buyers getting their contracts met, and the growers, doing everything to do that and taking all the risk to make that happen. So I think there's room for some evolution in contracts. And then the other thing around communication for planting schedules is, the other thing we hear all the time is a response from growers that they don't really get a lot of feedback coming their way when they're looking at what to produce and how the past year has gone, and what kind of forecasting buyers are looking at for the coming year. And so there's a lot of guessing happening at the grower level, and that just simply improved communication there could really help on that production scheduling. All right, one other thing I heard there was some interest in, so I want to mention our landfill ban. So what you're looking at here now is a map from our policy tracker that we have on our website. I want to just mention that we did this in partnership with the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, and Emily Broad-Leib, who's on your committee, is actually the expert who has informed all of this. So we're just sort of the information share, but all the expertise on this you actually have on your committee. And she's kind of written all the papers there are on the whole topic of landfill bans and how to do them well and how not, and what's worked and what's not working as well. We have 7 states now that have some kind of restriction on food going into landfills. And then several cities as well. So you have San Francisco, Seattle, Denver, and some others. I think we're going to see more of this, to be honest. There's a bunch of pending there have been some other tries. I think it was Ohio. I don't know, Emily, maybe you can help me out here. Who had a pending legislation on this that I think never went through. But I think we can expect that we will see more and more of this as pressures on landfills get tighter, and there's the greenhouse gas benefits and then all the benefits. Now, the most, I would say, the highest up on that hierarchy that we've seen is what California has done is in the process of implementing. And what they've done is they've not only set a goal of 75% of food being diverted from their landfills by 2025, but they've also set a goal that 20% of all the edible food in California be recovered for human consumption by 2025. And so they are in the process of interpreting that law that was passed in 2016, but only goes into effect in 2022. And they're just finalizing regulations on it. But actually what this is going to require is that the way that they're going about it is that all food businesses of a certain size will be required to donate as much of their edible food as possible. And so it's actually kind of creating a whole new industry in California where services are now popping up to help companies donate their food because it's going to be an actual requirement. On the policy side, another thing we've seen are tax incentives at the state level that are helping food donation. There's certainly some at the federal level as well. But more and more we're seeing states pass tax incentives. Oftentimes these are actually aimed at the farm level and they're tax credits rather than deductions, because the federal policy offers an enhanced tax deduction for food being donated. However, oftentimes growers are not able to take advantage of that tax deduction because they claim a loss anyways. And so a tax credit is seen as more valuable and more effective at the farm level. If you have any questions on this, please send them to Emily because, again, she has done a ton of work on this and really knows the ins and outs of how all these work. So just a word on data. I know when I was speaking with Rebecca about what was of interest to this committee, she mentioned kind of a lot of questions around how you get the information we get, like where does it come from? How are we measuring this? How are we tracking it? What I want to say is that when you think about actual measurement of food waste, it's super challenging, right? Nobody is out there digging in your garbage cans. Nobody's out there weighing them, weighing the dumpsters or tracking all of that. It's I would love to see, for instance, more automated measurement that's happening. I would love to see scales on waste trucks. It's something we see in the energy industry quite a bit, that there are smart meters that actually are measuring energy at the building level, and then they're giving that feedback and almost instantaneously on energy use, and that can help identify problems and help people manage their energy better. We just simply do not have that when it comes to food loss and waste. And so, when we're working on our models, we're using, any data sets we can get our hands on, as well as academic studies, and we're really just coming up with estimates. And so I could go into more detail on that if you'd like. There's been different approaches. That 40% number that you hear a lot actually is a caloric evaluation where they added up, done by the National Institutes of Health, and they added up all of the calories in the food supply that they know is after imports and exports, and then they took all of the calories they know get eaten, kind of the average amount that gets eaten, and they just took the difference and said, okay, there's about 40% of calories that are not getting eaten. That was one approach. Another has been much more, tangible, I guess I would say, where the USDA has looked at how much of each product is edible and how much is inedible, and then they look at sales data, or they look at some of these national data sets around consumption, and they, through that, come up with an estimate. But just to be clear, they are all estimates, and in terms of actual measurement, when we see actual measurement taking place, for instance, there's some software that can be put into restaurant kitchens to really help them track every single product that's going to waste and how much it weighs and what it is and why it's going to waste. We see huge improvements, like at the 30 to 40% level, when people are actually tracking their waste. So I think that's an area that's really interesting to me to see more focus on. Of course, there's a balance. You can get carried away with measurement and data, but certainly an area that could use improvement. And with that, I will turn it over to discussion. Thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dana. That was very, very good. I appreciate it. One question that occurs to me, I'm just curious if we see any big differences between the states and other countries because of the cost of food in the United States being so cheap comparative to the EU, for instance. Do we see a lot less waste in Europe than we do in the United States?
We do. I don't know that we can direct. I do think there is a correlation between cost of food and waste. So to take it to a further extreme, American consumers, the consumer level, waste about 10 times more than that of a consumer in Southeast Asia. Just to give you a sense, and where here food is a smaller portion of our budgets in the U.S. than anywhere else in the world. And so there's clearly some correlation there. In Europe, they do waste less per capita. And that may be a cost issue. I think there's also just sort of a customary issue with portion sizes. And if you look at the sizes of their refrigerators and how they do their grocery shopping. So, it's maybe more complex than directly just a cost thing, but I do believe that's a factor.
Okay. So I'd like to open up to the rest of the meeting group. I'm trying to get a view of it for.
You know what? I can stop sharing, and that will help probably.
Yeah, maybe if you could do that.
Gallery.
People's hands show up, and we got a bunch that have started. Let me start with Beth.
Hey, Dana, thanks. That was really interesting, and I could have a ton of questions with a lot of time, but I'll just start with one right now. And my name is Beth Sauerhaft with American Farmland Trust. I was looking at, if you go back to your slide 21, optimizing the harvest, your net financial benefits, tons of surplus, and climate mitigation. I'm curious, the net financial benefit, is that looking at the net financial benefit, say, to that farmer to optimize their harvest, or is there any taking into account the health costs to society for food or nutrition insecurity?
So the net financial benefit is the cost and savings, regardless of who's paying and who's saving combined, but we did not factor in externalities, kind of like you're saying. So, the potential for nutrition to happen and all the potential benefits of that, if we could get more produce out of the field and people eating it, that's not factored in directly.
Gotcha, thanks.
Matt, we have a couple more with their hands raised.
Yeah, unfortunately, my screen froze up. Sorry about that. So if you can hear me now, Jeanette was up next.
Yep. So Dana, thank you very much. That was an interesting presentation. I have a couple points I wanted to bring up because I live in California and get to deal with specialty crop growers all the time out here. I appreciate your work on the contracts. That is a major issue with the grading. And you are right, the farmers assume most of the risk. There was some work, I'm old enough to know, back in the 80s on the one issue you did not talk about, which was trying to stabilize the market price. Commodity prices is what drives a lot of this. And I refer you to maybe the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, I believe it's called. And there's a lot of work that is done there on that. The big issue that we have is you bring up public funding to help with some of these issues. I will tell you that from an advocate for agriculture, that is difficult because anytime there's a hurricane, a tornado, and there's any sort of crop insurance payments, subsidy of any kind for anything, we are put on hit list and shamed for taking it. So that has to be overcome. That's one of the first things I would talk about. I am concerned about your numbers. They are driving policy. I thank you for explaining, that a little bit. Because yesterday we were hearing about reducing the agricultural footprint, and I hope it's not a footprint in the number of farms that are going to be out there producing food. One other thing I think I wanted to talk about. That's it. So I really want to know about what kind of work. Okay, so I'll let Emily talk about what's happening out here in California. I'm concerned about our state tax incentives with the landfill. Well, first of all, she could talk about the landfill issues that we're having, but I'm concerned about the state tax incentives because we just lost 4 million acres in fires. There's no money. So how are they coming up with the funds for these tax incentives? Is that a feasible solution? That's sort of what I want to know.
Thank you for that so much. I'm not sure I can speak to most of that. I think when it comes to some of the federal or state programs that I've seen that help when I'm talking about public money, helping to get stuff off the field. For instance, Pennsylvania has a program called the PASS, I think, program. And that's actually a dedicated fund to cover pick and pack out costs for growers, when they have a field that can, that essentially it doesn't make sense for them to harvest, but that money covers the cost of harvest and transport to get it to the food bank system.
I'm sorry. The one thing I'd suggest when you were talking about gleaning, there's got to be something we could do. Like yesterday talked about the Good Samaritan Act. When you have farmers who don't want to let people come glean because of the insurance issues that they have and the liability and risk there. So somehow there's got to be some sort of way to alleviate that risk.
Yeah, I don't know. Emily, can you speak to that maybe? I know you've looked into that some.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting with the liability protections under the Emerson Act, and then every single state has a state version of those, they protect a lot, and they actually specifically, to your point, Jeanette, not only protect from liability if someone were to get sick from eating the food, but very explicitly protect if someone were to get injured when gleaning, that the landowner would be protected from liability because they're doing something in the social benefit. And I think it's a great thing for us to talk about in this group, I think, as well, that one thing that we see constantly is that this law exists, but there's not a lot of guidance. There's not like helpful information that is really tailored to different groups. And I think in particular, there's so much out there already, and a big piece might be making it really clear for producers that there's these protections and these benefits and that kind of thing. But I think it's a really, really good point. And I think we hear from the Food Waste Reduction Alliance has said more than 50% of businesses say that the reason they don't donate is because of fear of liability, even though there's this protection that exists.
Is there any issues with competitors, other farms that are having the same type of crop in the same area, and having someone come in and do the gleaning or whatever? What happens to their competitors in those instances? Is any work been done on that at all?
So you mean like when competitors are selling the product and the others are letting gleaning happen?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of orchards, particularly, during apple harvest season. You'll get some people will be making cider out of apples, right? And that's part of their thing. And that maybe the other farm doesn't have that capacity, and he's picked the apples for eating, and there's a bunch of extra apples. The other thing that's happened is sometimes they'll go in and, people want to pick up the drops for the cider, but it's nicer to pick up the apple from the tree itself, which is the higher quality fruit. And I don't know if people have run into those types of instances, but, as you get more congestion of people in your area, it seems those things occur.
I mean, I think gleaning only happens sort of after the fact, right? Like, or as a little bit of an afterthought often, where the grower's kind of done with that field, and then if there's still product left, for whatever reason, maybe they never touched it, maybe they've already harvested it and there's still product there, and then they kind of after the fact let others come in and glean. That's what I've seen.
All right, Jim, you're up next.
I got a couple comments, and I don't know, I'm sure you guys have addressed this or looked at this, but in Michigan, we have issues with migrant labor, and a lot of the getting the workers in to get harvest accomplished, and we have a lot of waste that happens just because the labor force is not there, or they're like this year. Of course, this year is an anomaly to everything. They couldn't get across the border to come in and help, but I guess, how are we going to go about addressing those issues in a way to reduce the food waste? And then with that too, going back to the gleaning and all that is a farm and their asset program that they have, and where does that play into? Again, it comes back to that liability. The other issue that sometimes we have run into in Michigan would be around the composting, and then what they're classified as either a waste, it's not really a waste generator, but there's special permitting that has to happen if you go to the composting. And then, what about addressing those issues? Again, these are just comments and considerations.
Yeah, so my response, maybe Emily has some other things to say here too, but the labor side of things, a huge issue. We hear it all the time. I think it's so complicated, right? The impacts are not just waste. There's all sorts of other stuff around it. And the other thing I've heard about that is that third party, labor has really moved towards a third party contracting system, whereas it didn't used to be quite as much. And that actually has been even kind of caused even more pressure around how you're using your labor when you do have them, in a way that does not incentivize, spending any time on anything but the highest grade product. And so I don't frankly understand and know the ins and outs of all of that labor contracting, but I think it's an interesting area. I know it's a real pain point for all sorts of reasons. And then on the composting permits, I don't know, Emily, you probably know that one better than I do.
So before Emily goes, one other comment on that. I think what the overarching item is the other policies that we have in place from our government and how it affects what what we're talking about here with the food waste and how we go about actually making sure that we don't have another policy that maybe trumps or causes us angst in another goal area that we have.
Emily, do you want to?
We've got about 5 minutes in this segment, and then we're going to go to the committee discussion around food waste. If you would ask people if they've got questions for Dana, now's the time to ask those. If you've got comments in general about food waste and our committee discussion, let's hold off till this segment's done.
Okay, so we'll move forward then. Garcia, did you have something? We got like 5 minutes, so I'm trying to go through the list of people that already haven't spoken yet.
Yes.
Yes, my question is related to logistics. In the state of California or in those municipalities that they're already starting the programs, or the farmers are starting to participate in whatever strategies the state are putting forward, how the state incentivize the farmers, or how is the relationship?
So I should mention that the state policy in California that requires edible food to be recovered does not apply to farms, because farmers are not, it's a landfill driven policy. And so because most farms are actually not sending very much to landfill, they kind of don't fall under that. In terms of incentivizing, there is I believe a state tax policy to incentivize farm donations, but other than that, they don't really touch logistics. And I would say that's a huge opportunity area, by the way, and one we've really seen highlighted through the pandemic, and what's been happening during the pandemic is that transportation is such a critical component, and cold storage as well, but really that transportation can be such a barrier to food being donated. And it's not covered. If you're a logistics company and you're donating your transportation of a product, you're not covered for liability, and you don't get any kind of tax benefit for doing that, whereas all the other steps do. So there's kind of an opening there.
Okay. All right. I think we're at the end of our time, but do you want to save some of your comments for our open discussion? Tom, I'm not sure exactly how you want to transfer to the next section of the discussion. Just open it up to.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Dana for being here today. You've presented a wealth of information. Very good job. Thank you. I'm sure the work group will have more questions going forward. So thank you for being with us today.
Super. Yep, best of luck with it. And I look forward to seeing where it all lands.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
All right. So we're going to try to open it up to the three speakers that we've had throughout yesterday and today, and try to get started on any comments that people have of where this committee, we really want to focus in on production ag issues, I think, is our first option, but we also are looking at all the things that we talked about the last day and a half. And unfortunately, I am having internet problems coming in and out continually, so I may need some help with this section, Tom. I'm sorry. It just, I keep freezing my screen.
Okay.
Okay, so Emily, I just was hoping that you could help get us started with some of the policies that have come through with your group, and kind of give us a little kind of background of what's going on with some of the policies that have already gone and happened. If you could just give us a little update.
Sure. I'd be happy to. And I think I can also respond. There were a couple questions that just came up that I think I at least have the beginning of an answer for. So let's see. One, let me respond to a couple of those, and then maybe I can give like a couple other perspective just in hearing the last 2 days. So I think one was just this issue of liability that came up a bunch of times, and I think like it seems to me like that is a real opportunity because there is really good protection, but it's sort of confusing what that protection means, and it's, in my opinion at least, part of it is that Congress wrote a statute offering protection, and usually when Congress does something, they ask an agency like EPA or USDA or something like that to then flesh that out and answer questions about it. And when that law was written, it was never like given to an agency to work on. And so anyone who wants to understand what protection is there have to go back and read the language of Congress, which, you know, as a lawyer, that's fun for me, but it's not really like a typical thing that most people do. So I do think there's a spot there where if it's helpful at some point in our discussions, I could just walk through what exists, and then we can talk together about, like, from the experience, even just with people on this committee, how that matches what challenges they face or what could be helpful there. But it's intended to be really protective, and farmers and gleaners are mentioned very specifically in that. So that was one. And then I think the other piece was, which Dana got to at the end, was on these, looking at these organic waste bans that states have passed, and the states that have passed them, as Dana said, it is in California, it's true elsewhere that they generally don't apply to farms. But I think one thing that could be interesting for us is that what we've seen in states that have passed these is that it leads to the development of a lot of new infrastructure, and that I think farmers can benefit from that infrastructure. So for example, if a state is saying restaurants and like hospitals and schools and whatever can't send, to reduce the amount of food they're sending to the landfill, then there becomes a lot of room for private industry to build facilities for composting and anaerobic digestion and better, food bank and food rescue. And I think there's the nexus to farmers would be both, which we've talked about a little bit before, but just that if we can overcome some of the issues, I think, Matt, that you raised around like nutrient management, that there might be opportunities for farms to benefit from taking some of that food waste, but also that if more infrastructure is built, then it makes it a lot easier for farmers and food producers to have places nearby where they could send their surplus and then, potentially get other benefits from that. So those were a couple of things that came up. And then I think, so just to give some perspective on my angle on this has been my program, we take on as clients different government agencies, nonprofits, food producers, food businesses that have legal questions about anything in food really, but the biggest area of our work has really been on these topics of food waste and food recovery. So having done a lot of this work, when we're able to, we take, if a question's coming up for one farmer or one state, then when we're able to, we try to put that out in materials that are helpful for others. And so we've looked at, in a very explicit detail, liability protection, the tax benefits that relate to food donation, the food safety questions that come up with donating food, and these organic waste bans, and a couple and date labels, which actually the way I first got to know Dana was that we partnered on a report on date labels that we had published in 2013. So we've been looking at that for a while. So I think on any of those, I'd be happy to just tell what I know to exist in terms of current federal law and in terms of where states are headed, if it's helpful, either for our working group or at any point. And then I think lastly, just sorry to take up a lot of space, but just from hearing some of the questions and ideas that came up yesterday and today, it occurs to me that there's maybe a bucket that we could look at around like funding and incentives to farmers, to states, et cetera, that could be a place for EPA to be thinking about either what they can do, like we can give advice on that, and if they can't do them, to pass those on to other agencies. There's a big piece around awareness, and I think we heard already that EPA is doing a lot of work on raising awareness, but maybe we can broaden for that, like what awareness would be helpful for farmers and we you know, on some of these topics. And then maybe something on like thinking about innovation and supporting innovation. So those were just a couple that kind of jumped out to me as bigger buckets, but that we then as a group could think about what do we want to do to fill in on some of those and share those ideas from the unique expertise of this committee.
Thank you. I think that's helpful. I don't see any hands raised at the moment, but I do actually have a comment on the food waste going into digesters. It's kind of interesting that the value of the gas is less if we take in food waste. If we have straight manure in a digester, we actually get more value, and it's to the point now where it's actually not as much of an advantage to take in the food waste as it had been a year or two ago, which is kind of an interesting problem. And I'm not sure why that is the case. The other thing that's we talked about a little bit was what comes along with the food waste and the plastics and the packaging. And I think that may be a reason why a lot of it wants to go into the landfills, is that for us to handle that depackaging problem, you have to buy some very specific equipment, whether you're composting it or whether you're digesting it. And cleaning up that food waste is a tremendous labor problem. So I still don't see any hands, and I don't know if I'm
Matt,
missing
you do
it.
have a couple of hands. Gary and Bill both have their hands up.
Okay, if you may have to help me with that. Gary, if you want to start, I'm just...
Yeah, I just have, excuse me, I just have a couple of comments. Years ago, we would let people, after our potato harvesters went through the field, small potatoes would fall through, and we would allow, you know, local people to come in and walk the fields and pick them up. And that worked all right until they couldn't find what they really wanted. And then if there was like a half of the field that was a different variety, it wasn't ready to be harvested yet, and we left that field and moved on to something that was ready, we found that these people would go over and steal potatoes out of rows that hadn't been harvested. So we put an end to that really fast. That just did not work out. And Dana spoke about targeting markets and only growing what you can sell and what you think you have a market for. Well, that's a pretty tough thing to do when if you get you don't know what the growing season's going to be. And if you get an ideal growing season, you get 400 hundredweight potatoes to the acre. Or a year like this year when it never rained and we averaged 150. So I just don't know how that's going to work. That's all I had.
Okay. Bill?
Well, I tell you, Mr. Chairman, I really have to thank you. When I said go ahead and put me where you need me, I never thought that I would get so involved in a conversation like this. But you know, there's a couple of us on this committee that have been involved in the ethanol industry, and we understand tax credits and RINs, and realizing that's already in place. I'd really like to know what that means and how that affects this project, because I keep hearing that farmers, you know, can't use really tax credit or tax RINs. I mean, we can all use tax credits at times, and plus it's an incentive where the government doesn't actually have to write a check. But when I look at this problem here, we basically can divide it into three buckets if I'm looking at this right. You know, we've got the field loss, which I've driven to California and Florida and seen all the tomatoes and whatever out in the field. But as a farmer, I also understand that, you know, we're the greatest human beings of overproducing, and a lot of that stuff out there. I know one of you said you're a pumpkin grower. I sure wish I could have that close to my feedlot, because I'm sure I could figure out a way to feed pumpkins to my cattle. But then you've got the outdated material that I know in Iowa, and I think this is really regionalized throughout the country. In Iowa, and I'll just pick on Des Moines, you know, between the food banks and the homeless shelters, I see just tons and tons and tons of food taken to those places and being utilized, and you might say be taken care of that. And then I guess my biggest issue are the restaurants. How many times have we gone out for supper or whatever? And my wife is really good at this. She orders this because she just wanted to taste it. Now, we're really good about taking those things home and eating them when we get there. But when I look at, someone mentioned yesterday about the 70s and 80s, and really it hasn't started since really the 80s. Well, I've got a real simple answer. I don't think our family, I'm fairly old, ever bought a bag of dog food till probably the 1990s, because our food scraps fed our animals. And that's basically how we got, took care of what was left over on our plates. We converted it to animals. And I hear a lot of discussion about composting, and someone mentioned it yesterday about the odors. A friend of mine is a composter in New York, and he lives next to a large egg crusher, and they asked him to take the shell residue that was left over, and the city shut him down because of the odor that it created. The other challenge we've got with composting, which I think is really regionalized, is, I live in Iowa where our topsoil is 8 feet deep. In New York, Duffy makes a tremendous living off composting because he does not have good dirt out there. They can make something from nothing. So I guess, and we don't need to dwell on it today, but I'd really like to understand the tax credits or the RINs that are out there, and maybe someone could be put in charge of that, just to send out a bullet point sheet so I can understand that. Because it's like water quality yesterday when Anna was talking about, she did not like, was it projects, or she didn't like, forget the word she used. Pilot projects. Well, Anna's been to my place. I think Tom's been to my place. A lot of you on this committee have been to my place through EPA, different tours that we've taken. We've got a farm here that we've kind of donated to Iowa, and we're doing those tests. We've tiled it so that we can, and we've quadrant it so we can understand what happens when you do a certain farming practice on 40 acres and then do something different on the next 40 acres next to it and the next 40 acres next to it. And we're capturing that water quality and doing the analysis to see how we've changed the effect of what we're doing. And, my whole goal in that was, I went and sat with Anna and Andrew Sayer at EPA here 2 years ago when I started this. And I said, the goal here is to figure out if we can reduce the nitrate level or whatever nutrient we're after, can I get a tax credit or a RIN on that? And we're showing definite possibilities here that by changing our farming practices on top, we're cleaning the water up. And so when I sat with Anna, I said, how do we talk about a tax credit or a RIN? Because they're already in place to incentivize the farmers or anybody involved in water, whether you're using saturated buffers, bioreactors, riparian buffers. How can we make this come to fruition? So I guess I'd really like to understand the tax credit or the RIN that is behind food waste today. And I think that probably goes back more to the farmer producing it. But like I say, I've been through some of those.
I keep freezing up here.
I've been through some of those fields when they're doing that, and you're right. But I go back to my 3 buckets. I'm trying to understand how to sort this out, because this is a huge, huge discussion. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe Emily, if you want to just touch on the tax credits a little bit again, and see if I see your hands up next anyway.
And I was actually going to respond on that. So thank you, Bill, for the question. I hope one day I'll get to visit your farm as well. It sounds amazing. On the tax piece, I'm happy to share more information, I think, but to clarify, so the issue at the federal level, there's an enhanced tax deduction for donating food. So when you donate like money or other in-kind goods, you can get a general tax deduction that's the basis value of that item. So the cost to you to acquire it, and the enhanced deduction that's special for food because Congress really wanted to encourage donation of food. you can claim the lesser of 2 times the basis value or the basis plus 1/2 the profit margin. So from my understanding, and I would love to hear from you and others on this, the challenges that we hear from farms are first that it's a deduction and not a credit. And like, I think for businesses that don't have a huge profit, a credit is a lot better than a deduction. If you don't have a huge profit, then there's nothing to deduct from. So even though you can carry that deduction for 5 years, we've heard that it's just not a lot of value. And so I think what Dana mentioned and what we've looked at is that to fill in that gap, a lot of states have said, let's create a credit that's special for farmers. And I think my opinion would be that if there's a benefit at the federal level that's really great for all these businesses, but not great for farmers, could there be an alternative that's really targeted to farmers that they could use instead? And then I think the other issue we've heard from farms, and I'm happy to send this out and I'd love to vet this, my understanding with everyone, is that the fact that for each item you have to do this calculation of like the 2 times the basis or the basis plus 1/2 the profit margin and then claim the lesser of those, that it's really complicated to do this for like each item that you might be selling, and just requires a lot of paperwork. It's not as straightforward as the way that states have structured their credits. So I don't know if that makes sense at all. And like I said, I would love to share more and kind of vet my understanding that I've gotten so far on this question. But it just seems to me that it was more written for like retailers and food manufacturers and wasn't really written for farmers, and that maybe there's an opportunity to say that something else is needed. And the nice thing is too, that it brings value, brings dollars back to farms for doing something that's in the public good. So that was all I wanted to add on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Barry?
Yes, thank you, Matt. I just had a couple things I wanted to comment on. I was going to ask the question, where do schools fit into the food waste, but I'm going to assume that they probably fit into institutional and food service. Would that be right, Emily? Okay. And touching on that subject, I think that if part of our charge is to reduce landfill waste by 50%, looking at some of those graphs, the homes and consumer facing businesses, which institutions are part of, produce 83% of the waste to landfills. So I think it'd be very easy to say that your 50% could be a major portion could come from those 2 things. And I like the talk about schools and the amount of waste that come from schools or is generated from schools, and also the education of our young children and stuff. I mean, God forbid we teach them something good, but climate change is pretty important, and it's becoming more and more in view of everyone. But to get the youngsters to think about this stuff in school and what they can do as their part to reduce food waste going to the landfills is something that I just find interesting. The other thing, Emily, you brought up the liability protection, and maybe that's a recommendation that we have, because if there's stuff that Congress worked on but no agency took it up to do anything further with it to compartmentalize it or simplify it to where producers or operators could more easily understand it, maybe that's something that's needed, that one of the agencies or EPA needs to take that or grab a hold of it and put it into some form or shape that can be recognized and used simpler. And that would allow these other producer groups maybe to expand their endeavors into something else if those liabilities are understood, or if they can get protection under those. So that's just the comments that I had.
Thank you, Barry. Jimmy? You're muted. There you go.
Here we go. Got you. I've got a question, and it basically kind of runs down to this: is what did we learn during COVID about our food production systems and processing? I know there's several of our commodities, for beef and milk stands out in my mind, and I know a lot of the specialty crops. We really had a trouble getting, spinning on that pivot to go from institutional packaging to retail. And, a lot of the questions that we have out there is some of this just-in-time inventory being so efficient that we weren't able to, bring that product to the shelves as quickly as we might have if we had some, I guess, in a lack of a better word, waste. And so I just was wondering, what have we learned different in the last 9 months about food waste, and how might we also, a lot of the consumers were very nervous whenever those shelves got empty, and rightly so. So what have we learned, and how does this work into the food waste equation?
Well, I know on my farm particularly, I'm still producing less milk than I could at the same basic cost. And we were dumping milk for almost 2 months before we regulated the herd to where we needed to be. And so it's a bit of an issue. Nick, I want to try to hit everybody before we run out of time.
No, I appreciate, I entered this not very educated on this subject. I appreciate all the presentations and information. One comment I would make is, and I have younger children, and I've gone through the school lunch program with them, and we have what I would call a buffet style school lunch system program that's not provided by our schools anymore, but you have lots of choices, and I can see the waste. But one educational piece is my daughter did ask me probably a year ago where our trash goes. She says, how does it just disappear every Friday? And I think the education of our youth not knowing that landfills and, the things they hear today on climate are the bad burning engines and emissions and those type of things. And I think just an education piece needs to be, I think Barry or somebody said it, needs to be reiterated through our educational system, that the way Americans have come accustomed to a throwaway society is probably being impactful on our climate change. So that's just a few comments I have, but I really appreciate everybody's work on this. This has been a very interesting topic. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any. Oh, Bill, do you have a hand up? No. Does anybody else have any comments to make?
Matt, this is Tom. I might just add, I'm kind of hearing a couple of themes here. One is around this whole tax credits, incentives discussion, and maybe there's something there that EPA could help with or have some impact on. I'm kind of intrigued on the top of the food recovery hierarchy that reduce their source reduction. And I think one of the things there that might fit in well with the pesticides group is just making sure that more of the food that's grown actually makes it to the edible stage. I mean, when we hear that there's 50 million people are food insecure, I mean, maybe we're not producing the right thing, but certainly it's not that there's a lack of food. I mean, there's not an abundance of food. We need to do a better job of getting food to market. So I'm thinking about the crop protection tools and the discussion we're going to have this afternoon with the pesticides work group. Maybe that fits in here also, and just EPA continuing to bring products to market that makes more of our food edible. In other words, if we can reduce the pest blemishes, the fruit that for whatever reason it rots in the field, it has pest damage, it's imperfect. If we can have more of that make it to market, it would seem to me like that would be a good thing to have happen. So just continuing, whether it's bioengineering or active ingredients or whatever, to make more of the food that's actually grown, make it to market. And then I think, I mean, you've hit on a number of items around this composting digester. There seems to me like there's a number of barriers there, and you know, looking at those barriers and identifying those things that keep more food from going to compost, whether it's a permitting scheme that's overly burdensome, or a public risk from odors or whatever might be there, asking EPA to help us reduce some of those barriers so that more producers are able to participate in that aspect, take food out of the landfill and put it into either a digester, a composter, produce something usable out of that material. So I don't know if that helps, but I'm kind of like Bill. I'm trying to think of what buckets can we start to focus on, and where does it impact ag and EPA have an influence is what I'm thinking there.
Yeah, agreed. So we got a couple more hands up, and then I'm probably going to be running out of time. So Garcia.
Yes, I'm going sort of in the same direction of Tom, because I have some data gaps in my head. Some of them might be just that I don't know the information and it assists, but I think also that the whole process have some real data gaps that is difficult to establish that link between the farm and the landfill, and how would a program or any recommendation towards how the farmers can contribute to reduce the loss or the waste could be. So I think that as a group, we also should be trying to look into real information and data gaps, because EPA has could be recommended to. We could recommend that they do some actual studies as part of the regulation. They can put information collection rules and other types of data collection tools that can help us understand better what is that contribution and where the opportunities are for the farmers to work in these programs. So what I'm saying is that we have to develop recommendations, but we also could recommend where we don't feel too comfortable that EPA gathers that information.
Well, I certainly think we need to get more information about what's going into the landfills and why. So that's going to be an important thing for us to get more information on. So Lauren, I think you're going to drive us to the end of our session with your question.
Okay, thank you. I've really appreciated the information today and yesterday. This is not a place where I spend a ton of time, so I just want to say that. I'm also kind of headed in the direction of the last couple comments. Here in Illinois, we do see a lot on food systems and taxes and things like that. However, I just keep thinking about the role of the committee, and I think we'll probably try to do this in pesticides too, because we could kind of go all over the place. But I keep thinking about, what Tom has charged us before, what should the agricultural community be asking of EPA? And so in this setting, I really do think that we're about to hear a lot, and maybe this will inform this a little bit more on the pesticide. They spend a ton of time at the agency working on various pesticide products so that we don't have waste. And so I am, obviously, as the work group chair of that next committee, kind of thinking about that natural connection there. And then I'm also thinking about, and I think this was said earlier in the day, sort of that technological support out of the agency. From our standpoint in Illinois, we do have some dairy farmers who are interested in methane digesters. And I feel like there is a major disconnect between the things that are sort of press release and grants and technology awards to translating that down at the state level so that people can actually implement that. And the way that has worked is that sometimes we go to our state agencies and we say, hey, we've, you guys talk about methane digesters, you talk about all these things for manure, but can you help me get it done? And it is what the chairman just said, it tends to kind of get lost in the maze of permitting structures, and the technology just doesn't make its way to the farm like it should. So I think trying to find ways to streamline not just the discussion of we should be doing X to minimize waste, but we should actually help to put it on the farm by using technology and a little bit of creative thought with regard to permitting. So those are, I think, my major closing points.
So I actually misspoke. We actually have another 10 minutes or so if anybody has more comments. But I do want to say something about digesters that's kind of important. Is a lot of the digesters today, you need a couple thousand cows to make it efficient enough so that you can actually pencil it out. And there's a lot of technology beyond the states where smaller digesters come into play, and you can actually make an efficient digester in Europe because the price of energy is a little bit higher, and they actually grow crops for digestion for energy. So they're looking at that green energy with a little more value than we do here in the States. And part of the problem is that as you get these bigger digesters, it comes in with bigger problems, especially in smaller states like Connecticut or all of New England for that matter, where, a couple thousand cow dairy is not really on the docket. People are not interested in that size agriculture, especially in the Northeast, where there's a lot of people, and people and animals don't always mix very well. But the animals can actually, those manures that you digest with act as a buffer, and they can take a lot of food waste and make the energy out of it, and the manure helps the conversion. So it's actually a plus, but you can't do it on a large scale because of where we are in the country. So it's a catch-22, and I'm afraid that unless we get some support, and it could be pilot projects, which I know EPA is not all that excited about, but it does help to, first thing, how do you clean and not contaminate the food waste coming onto your farm to mix with those manures, and how can we get some of the technologies that our European cousins have that actually would work on smaller farms and be appropriate. So there's just a lot of questions there, and I think EPA could be a catalyst to answering some of them. Is there any other comments?
Matt, this is a question that I probably should ask one of the speakers. Emily, maybe you could help us. I'm still a little confused on definitions. I heard yesterday that food loss was considered more at the farm level. So production up to the farm gate, is that right? And then food waste was what was considered once it left the farm, went to processing, distribution, consumption. Is that right?
It's my understanding, and I will say, and I think Dana's caveat this morning that like one issue, and this could be something we recommend, there seem to be lots of different definitions, and it sounded like possibly even between the agencies they're defining it a little differently. But my understanding is food loss is food that is edible and is being thrown away, and food waste is food that is like inedible parts and things like that. But I would, you know, we probably should confirm how EPA is defining it at the moment.
I know when we start looking at, you know, she was talking about the peels and the, you know, parts of the food that they consider waste, whereas, you know, when you're a ruminant, those peels like orange peels and grapefruits and all of those fruits make a pretty good feed, you know, just like the brewer's grains. And there's a lot of different byproducts that are considered waste in the production of food for humans that our ruminant animals can digest and make into, you know, animal proteins. So I really think that a lot of that waste stream it's just a matter of where you are in the country. When, you know, if in New England we don't have large produce areas where we can get those, you know, commodity products. So it really has to do with where you are in the region of the country. Any other comments before we go ahead, Barry?
Yeah, Tom, I think you're referring to, was it Lana yesterday that she mentioned for food loss, it was from, she defined it as farm to consumer or to retail, and then food waste was the rest of the way of the chain from retail to the customer to table or fork. I think that's what you referred to, and that's kind of how she put it, and that's how I understood it, and I thought that, my God, I've got a definition, and yes, now I know. Like that may be the case.
Any other comments? Everybody's getting ready for a stretch, I think. Well, I appreciate all your comments, and I think the next step of this would be for our committee to get together, our ad hoc work group. We'll get together and try to go to the next step. I believe that what we really want to do is start to make recommendations. I think we need to start talking about tax credits as part of it. We want to think about what we can do to encourage more of this, I guess, a mix of food and packaging, and how we can solve some of that problem from going to the landfills and coming back to composting and digesters. We got a whole lot of information, I think, the last day and a half, and we need to filter through a little bit. And I think when we get our work group together, we'll start to try to formulate some recommendations.
Matt, thank you very much. Thank you for leading our discussion the last 2 days. And I really want to thank our speakers. This is one area where certainly I don't have a lot of expertise, and we've had a lot of really good information presented. And thank you to all of those who presented information to the FRRCC. It's very muchly appreciated. Thanks to the ad hoc working group for your efforts and your time. This is a tough one to get our arms around. It's a very big subject, has a lot of impacts outside of agriculture, and I think it's our challenge to bring it back to the impact that it has on the farms, ranches, and how we can advise EPA to help with this problem. So with that, we'll close our discussion on food loss and food waste. We will go to our break that's scheduled to go from 1 to 1:15. Let's be back promptly at 1:15, and we will begin the ad hoc working group discussion or our committee discussion on pesticides. So with that, we will take a break and be back at 1:15. Thank you.